financial consequences for tens of millions of people, it is important that our constituents know whether or not the people making these decisions are sharing the pain or insulated from the pain. For example, in the case of young people, many SAGE experts say that young people should be working from home. We know young people are now tied to their small kitchen tables in their bedroom in miserable environments, the new dark satanic mills, working endless hours in appalling circumstances because people with nice gardens and comfortable homes think that's what they should be doing.
Yeah.
There should also be far greater personal accountability. There should be no more, here is Sir Mark Walport, of SAGE, but here in a personal capacity. Nonsense, he's there because he's a member of SAGE. And we should also have elections to SAGE. So we could see Sir Mark Walport, Professor Susan Mitchie, John Edmonds, regular talking heads in our TV studios, challenged by people with a different perspective. People like Professor Carol Sikora, Professor Paul Dolan, who is an expert on human behaviour and quality of life, Professor Ellen Townsend, who has a huge interest in the welfare of children and adolescents who are now being plagued by anxiety and eating disorders. I give way to my...
He's making a great case with which I largely agree, but will he agree with me that experts are only human and we've been, to an extent, asking the impossible of them? They're risk-averse, they don't want to be blamed for a disaster, they'll choose to give advice that's cautious. Would he join me in recommending to the Prime Minister the reforms that I've put forward to have competitive, multidisciplinary expert advice with Red Team Challenge?
It's a fantastic and a plausible suggestion. We need a diversity of voices, but of course if we had elections we could get people elected from independent SAGE, and we know what they want: harder lockdowns, tighter lockdowns, and a permanent end to freedoms. Yeah. But Mr. Speaker, there is an alternative. There is an alternative to elections, to financial disclosure. There is an alternative, and that is the Prime Minister could say to members of SAGE, he could say this to them. He could say, here it is. You can either advise me, or you can advise the Today programme, Sky, Channel 4, but you can't do both. You can't do both. You can either be a serious scientist at this moment in time, advising your government, or you can be a media talking head, building a career outside SAGE, but you can't do both. And I think that is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. We would not expect our generals to give a running commentary on a war, undermining politicians. It's just not acceptable. It's just not acceptable, Mr. Speaker. Can you imagine if the clerks of my committee who advise my committee were going out and briefing what they'd like to see my committee do, pushing us into a corner all the time? It wouldn't be tolerable. It wouldn't be tolerated in this place, and it shouldn't be tolerated by number 10. So here it is: full financial disclosure from SAGE, full elections, or they advise the government, and if they don't want to do that and advise TV studios, they do that, but they don't do both.
Graham Stringer.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and as ever it's an honour to follow the honourable gentleman. What I would say to what he's saying, his interesting point about SAGE, is we could do with full disclosure from the government about all the facts that they have available to them on COVID. This morning at the Science and Technology Committee, we were told that vaccinations have saved 14,000 lives. I have no doubt that that's an accurate figure. But there are many figures that have not been given. And as we said last time we debated this, only one side of the equation is given. Let me ask this question: how many lives have been lost in order to save the capacity in the NHS? And I think when it comes to looking at the untested people, the untreated people from cancer, from heart disease and other diseases, we will find that those figures are of a similar, if not greater magnitude than the people who have died from COVID. We should also have transparency and open declarations of what really happened with the 26,000 deaths in care homes, where untested people were sent to those care homes from hospital. We should have disclosure about all those people who were triaged by age and were not treated, or all those people in care homes who were not allowed into hospitals because they weren't taking people from care homes. There's a great deal more information that we require in order to make a rational decision about whether this lockdown should continue. I agree with the Honourable... Just one second. I agree with the Honourable gentleman from New Forest West, I think it is, that what we have here is the government asking for emergency powers when there is no longer an emergency. I give way to my colleague from...
I thank the honourable member opposite for giving way. He was at Science and Technology with me this morning. Does he share my disquiet at the fact that the vaccine effectiveness numbers that Public Health England have published of 96% against hospitalisation for Pfizer with 2 doses and 92% for Oxford AstraZeneca against hospitalisation are much higher than the numbers that have been plugged into the models that Imperial and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine have used to underpin the data that the government is relying on?
I do agree completely that those are the numbers, the real numbers, as opposed to model numbers, are the numbers that should have been plugged into that model. They would have given a different scenario. And the Honourable Gentleman makes my point. In order to come to rational decisions about what risks as a country we should take and what risks individuals should take, we should have all the information up to date and available. I think that the government has refused on a number of occasions to give that information out. They have run a campaign to scare people into accepting the decisions that the government have made. And if I can go back to the Honourable Gentleman who's talking about elections for SAGE, at least the behavioural psychologists who advise the government have made a public apology that they say they've undermined their own professional credibility by joining in that campaign of fear. And I wish the government not only would put out more information, but that they would also apologise for frightening people. They shouldn't frighten the electorate, and they certainly shouldn't frighten the people in this chamber for taking people's liberties away. One of the things that has annoyed me most in terms of the last 15 months is when the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health stand up and say, we instruct you, meaning the population, to do various things. There is nothing in the legislation that would give the Secretary of State or the Prime Minister the ability to instruct individuals. We live in a liberal democracy where we pass laws, and those laws are enforced by the police, and then the courts take a decision if there is a prosecution, not where the Secretary of State acts like some kind of uniformed Minister of the Interior. I will vote against this today. We need a more direct debate on the issue, and we need to, as members of Search For, we need to have a straightforward comparison with real statistics about what risks everybody face.
Thank you, Evans. Mr. Deputy Speaker, for over 800 years, this House has been making decisions on risk, be it sending men and women to war, providing financial support, instigating reform in trades or even laws. And tonight's vote boils down to an assessment of risk. Essentially, there are 3 options. We open on the 21st, we delay, or we close and put more lockdown measures back in. Now, if we accept the premise that we can't get rid of COVID, we can disregard the reintroduction of lockdown rules on the basis that it's too risky to the economy, to non-COVID health and education. And even a tiered approach to deal with regional variation, I don't think would be stomached by the public. So that leaves us with 2 options, open as planned or delayed. Now, I've checked the data like many of you on the dashboard this morning, and it shows the 7-day increase of cases, the average, is 38.8%, and hospitalisations increasing by 22%. We also know that we've vaccinated 79% of the population with 1 dose, 57% with 2 doses. But we also know that no measure is 100% effective, no mask is 100% effective, and no vaccine is 100% effective. But we know if you put those measures all together, you mitigate the risk. And this is all on the backdrop against a Delta variant which is 50 to 70% more contagious than the Alpha variant at Christmas, which in turn itself was 50 to 70% more virulent than the original. So therefore, this House is being asked to make a judgment call. Carry on opening as we are, risk further spread, increase hospitalisation, or buy time, see the trend, get more vaccinated, and reassess. But of course, at the expense of businesses and freedom. This is another Sophie's choice. But from what I know from my constituents, they won't thank this House for a 4-week delay. But they will not forgive this House if further lockdowns return. And so I will vote to support the motions today. But this still leaves certain sectors as zombie industries, not officially closed, but not open because there aren't enough customers. The travel, the events, the weddings industry, the nighttime economy. So I urge the government to consider sector-specific support. Now, some listening might mistake my words for the sound of a risk-averse man, or a doctor who thinks too much about health. But in my day job, my entire career has been spent managing risk, from dealing with people's cholesterol to a headache to working out if it's stress or a brain tumour. But I did that openly and frankly with my patients. And now this is what we need from the government. A debate on what is the acceptable level of COVID risk. There were 1,500 deaths on the UK road and 25,000 deaths or serious injuries last year. We as society accept this risk. We could ban all road travel and stop all deaths. But of course, we lose the economic benefits and our freedoms. During the next month, I urge the government to bring forward a debate on the risk this House is prepared to accept regarding COVID. After all, as I said at the start of this speech, the House has been deciding this for 800 years. Why should it change now?
Christy Matheson.
Deputy Speaker, I'm sorry that the Secretary of State's not in his place because he's a Chester lad, and I was hoping to offer him some Cestrian solidarity with the criticism of being termed totally F*** hopeless, and given assurance that I would never have used F*** myself. But he needs a bit of support here because he clearly hasn't got very much on the other side. There's the announcement and the process leading up to today has been typical of this government as handling, chaotic and totally lacking in clarity. One minister says one thing, next the same day, and another minister says something slightly different or even wholly contradictory. The announcements drip out inconsistently in a series of leaks and pre-briefings. And actually people would understand the government's position. I think we've had news this afternoon that we've got the highest number of cases since February. That has just been announced. People would understand the government's position if the government would level with them and be more honest than they are. And the reason the government aren't being honest is because of the serried ranks of the honourable members behind from the Libertarian COVID Research Group wing that are putting undue pressure, understandably, but ministers need to stand up to it instead and be a lot more open and direct with people. The other thing we need, of course, is a lack of the Prime Minister giving his usual bluff and bluster and bombast, creating false hope, using phrases like my honourable friend for Rhonda talked about, Terminus Day, Freedom Day, building people up when he doesn't know that he can deliver it, and then conveniently forgetting that he said it in the first place. It doesn't help the process. In Cheshire West and Chester, we've gone into enhanced measures. Not quite sure exactly what that means, because it can mean anything that people want it to, again, because of a lack of clarity from the government. They suggest, they advise that people perhaps don't meet indoors. But what it does mean is that because there's no instruction, there is no support for businesses. There's no support for the nighttime economy. There's no support for the visitor economy, which Chester is so important. I was contacted by Jamie Northrup from Alexander's Live in Chester. It's a brilliant venue. It's a small venue. He's been working his socks off just to keep afloat during this pandemic, and in common with everybody else, and honourable members will know this from their constituents, the hospitality sector and pubs have been doing everything that has been asked of them to meet restrictions, to try and keep afloat, and it often hasn't happened. Jamie talked to me about the Music Venue Trust's 6-point plan for support, including extending the moratorium on commercial evictions and cancelling the introduction of business rates from the 1st of July. He points out that there are 3 issues in the 6-point plan that actually are in direct direct control of the government to be able to deliver. And I urge ministers to look very carefully at that. It's all well and good asking, advising, cajoling, but there has to be support if we are going to extend, because so many businesses will have put their business planning into place for the relaxation that is not now going to take place, and we need to give the extra support to get over that final hurdle. I thought the honourable member gentleman from Bosworth who just spoke talked about the zombie sectors, those sectors that are alive but aren't quite alive. It was a fantastic phrase that absolutely pins this problem down, and there are other sectors where they will not be able to pick up straight away because of the time lag in terms of the nature of their sectors. Aviation, travel and tourism, aerospace. I chair the aerospace group. There has to be consideration for longer term support for these, because they will not be able to pick up straight away. But one final point. We do not seem to be getting enough actual physical supplies, physical doses of the vaccines in Cheshire West and Chester compared to other areas. Can the Minister look at this, please? Because we don't seem to be able to be getting our fair share.
Steve Baker.
Speaker, I refer to the declarations I've made relating to the COVID recovery group. No one can deny the brilliance of the government's, the NHS's vaccination programme. By mid-April, the over 50s and the vulnerable had had their first vaccination, and overwhelmingly now they have had their second. That is reflected in the ONS antibody data, which is shows extraordinary levels for anyone over 50. Antibodies are there in that population which is vulnerable to the disease. That, though, brings me on to the best case which can be made for today's regulations, and that is that a small percentage of a big number is still a very big number. And it seems to me that that is the best case the government could make, that actually the ability of the NHS to provide other health care could be compromised by admissions from a younger population, because a small percentage of a big number is still a big number. But the big problem with that, the huge problem with that, is it concedes the point that our liberties can be used to manage the capacity of the NHS. And I can't concede that. My right honourable friend from Forest of Dean raised it earlier. That's not the way we should be going as a society. And I think if these restrictions which we're extending had been proposed for that purpose in the past, we would never have accepted them. Now, in Wickham, people, of course, have been dutifully washing their hands, covering their faces, keeping social distancing rules. And yet early in this pandemic, I remember one dear, sweet lady, older lady, was beside herself with anxiety at the thought of having to go about her ordinary life with her face covered. And look at us now, taking it for granted. This is not normal. This is the dystopia which I stood here and forecast on the day we went into lockdown. Thousands of pubs and restaurants, theatres have struggled by, if open at all rather, then just breaking even, hardly breaking even. We've been told by UK hospitality that they're still making a loss. The truth is the government hasn't got a systematic way of showing us the cost benefit of the measures that they propose. One of my colleagues earlier mentioned Professor Paul Dolan. I've done a lot of work with him. I'll write to ministers with a paper from him. He shows how to look not just at the splash of policy, but the ripples too. We really need to get this sorted out and embedded in a new Public Health Act, together with reform to modelling, and also some changes to expert advice, which I raised in an intervention. One of the most important things I think we've learned from Mr Cummings' leaked WhatsApp messages is that it seems the government's been significantly influenced by polling. I fear we'll have had a real doom loop here between polling and policy making, which has driven us into a disastrous position. We We now must not tolerate lockdowns perpetually on the table. We must not tolerate a situation going on where we and the police are unclear about what the law is and how it should be applied. I mean, imagine that you can hug but not dance. What madness is this? We can't tolerate a situation anymore in which a government social scientist told the author of the book A State of Fear that the government had used unethical techniques of behavioural science to deliver a policy which he said, in his own words, smacks of totalitarianism. We have transformed this society for the worst. We have put in place a culture and habits which will take years to shake off, culture and habits which distance people from one another and diminish their quality of life, the quality of relationships that they have with one another. High streets are in danger of becoming haunted alleyways. We are in danger of hollowing out and destroying the entertainment industry, much that makes life worth living. Today's vote will go through. It's a foregone conclusion. But as one of my other right honourable friends said, was he implied, if the Conservative Party does not stand for freedom under the rule of law, in my view, it stands for nothing. We have got to have a turning point. We've got to recapture a spirit of freedom.
Very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It feels a little bit like Groundhog Day. Another month, another debate on COVID regulations. Yet we really shouldn't be here having this debate today. For people and businesses up and down the country, this 4-week delay to fully restoring our freedoms is a huge and very costly blow. Yet the sacrifices that continue to be demanded of the British people are not being coupled with the support that they need to do the right thing. And that is why Liberal Democrats will not be voting with the government tonight on the public health provisions. And whilst we support the motion on continuing the hybrid proceedings in this place, I would gently ask the Minister why it is the government thinks we as Parliament need to continue meeting in a hybrid way, whereas councils up and down the country have been forced to meet in person, often at great cost when they're already under huge amounts of pressure. As my Liberal Democrat colleagues and I have been saying for the past 6 months, the way to restore our freedoms must be three-pronged: vaccination, test, trace and isolate, and robust border controls. And the point's already been made countless times that the reason we're here is because ministers undoubtedly failed completely on the last of those 3 points by putting India on the red list far too late for political reasons, allowing the Delta variant to be seeded into the community. But even once the Secretary of State recognised it as a variant of concern, we know there was a 17-day delay in designating it as such, which meant surge testing commenced far too late. That cannot happen again. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the situation we find ourselves in was avoidable. Ministers must take full responsibility for having to delay the lifting of restrictions next week, and part of that responsibility is to support people to do the right thing. With businesses on their knees, jobs are at risk, and many of the self-employed have yet to get a penny of support. Hospitality, events, weddings, culture, tourism and travel industries are on their knees. Even after domestic restrictions are lifted, we know that the travel sector will have to continue to bear the brunt of restrictions, given the biggest threat to our full reopening in the UK will be variants brought back in through international travel. So the complete lack of a bespoke package of support for these industries beggars belief. Now, if we want to restore our freedoms fully next month, as the Prime Minister has promised us, and allow our economy to thrive again, then testing every potential case, tracing every contact and supporting self-isolation is absolutely critical. Experts have been calling for better financial and practical support for the past year, and finally the penny dropped earlier this month for the former head of Test and Trace that supported self-isolation was the missing piece. Yet still, there has been no comprehensive package announced to pay people their wages to self-isolate, provide accommodation if necessary, and support those with caring responsibilities. This is the way to break chains of transmission and to stop new outbreaks in their tracks. It's also an awful lot cheaper than blanket restrictions. Now, learning to live with this virus, as I believe we absolutely must, requires a proper strategy and an action plan, not hoping for a fair wind. It brings together the UK's world-leading genomic sequencing capability with traditional public health test and trace at a local level, coupled with the right support. Our public health directors up and down the country are crying out for this. They will continue to be our front line for managing this virus as we learn to live with COVID. Let's give them them the tools they need, and not be back here again in a month's time asking for a further delay, or worse still, months down the line, be asked to reintroduce restrictions.
Congratulations on your well-deserved recognition in the Queen's Birthday Honours List. Dame Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And isn't it wonderful to see so many colleagues in the chamber having a proper debate? And it is really interesting to hear what colleagues have to say. And I have to add my own deep concern about any restrictions on people's liberty. And frankly, if we weren't already in step 3 of lockdown anyway, I cannot imagine that anyone in this place would today vote for 4 weeks of restrictions on businesses, on weddings, on church congregations, and yes, on young people's end of school year celebrations with the current data that we have. But nevertheless, I'm going to disappoint some of the colleagues in this place by saying I will, with a very heavy heart, support the government, trusting that the government is determined, as we've been assured by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, that if possible, those restrictions will be lifted after 2 weeks and not 4 weeks. I urge them to do that. But I want to use these very short remarks to raise a few specific questions on behalf of my constituency and others. Firstly, there are many businesses in the hospitality sector that are open but unable to make a profit because of the social distancing rules. Can these be relaxed a bit in this last few weeks? Surely we can do that. Secondly, many employers in hospitality and other sectors are now desperately trying to recruit staff through job centres. And yet, I'm told by businesses in my patch that many people are not responding to offers for interviews. And I don't know if other colleagues are finding that as well, but clearly what businesses in my area are concerned about is the long period of enforced lockdown and enforced inactivity is leading to an issue of motivation, and sometimes it's just easier to stay at home rather than get back out there again. What are we going to do? Many colleagues have talked about the success of frightening people into staying home. Surely we're going to need something to help people to feel motivated and to want to get back out there to work, to get our economy going again, and to help themselves recover from this difficult period. Thirdly, my constituency is home to Silverstone and the British Grand Prix, and it is due to take place from July the 16th to the 19th. So can my honourable friend assure me that this iconic, world-famous event, surely one of the best of British, can it go ahead with a capacity crowd, albeit subject to COVID testing? Fourth, I was pleased that the government has listened to the many wedding businesses and couples looking to tie the knot and have agreed to let weddings of any size go ahead subject to social distancing. But as colleagues have said, and as my honourable friend will appreciate, for many couples, being able to hug but not dance, you can't have a band, you've got to socially distance, that's not the kind of big day that they wanted for themselves and their families. So can he reconsider this? And finally, my honourable friend will realise that school and university students are now faced for the second year in a row with no end-of-year celebrations, no parents' days, no prize givings. In other words, none of the real rites of passage that mean so much to so many people. Can we look at this again in these last few weeks? It's been such a long haul. And as I've said, I will reluctantly support the government. But I do urge the front bench to show more flexibility during this final few weeks so that some of the joys of summer can light up people's lives once again.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. What a mess. A hopeless border policy, a hopeless promise of Freedom Day, and a hopeless government left ducking for political cover. We may have grown used to it by now, yet another letdown from this hopeless government during this pandemic, which at times has seemed endless. We've been here before with the Prime Minister, and yet it still hurts every time. Mr. Deputy Speaker, businesses in Luton North, which still can't reopen, are left now without any hope. Families still separated after months and months, and young people not being able to do all the fun things that young people should be doing. Just like when government let us down in December, yet again, it's all beginning to look a lot like Christmas. An offer of freedom being dangled in front of people by a gung-ho, hopeless Prime Minister, only for it to be pulled away from us at the last minute when his bumbling and blustering gets the better of him. We'll turn the tide on coronavirus in 3 weeks, he said. It'll all be over by Christmas, he said. June 21st will be our Freedom Day, he said. People in Luton North understand that this delay is necessary to slow the spread of the Delta variant, but it is a bitter pill to swallow for the couples having to rearrange their wedding plans, the birthday celebrations missed, the people with loved ones abroad who will have to wait even longer to see them. All people wanted all along from the Prime Minister is for him to be upfront and honest about the difficult situation our country's in. At times of crisis, the country's not looking for a funny best mate. They're looking for a leader. But instead, we've got a Prime Minister who is too scared to tell it how it is. And it didn't really have to be this way. On this side of the House, we've been warning about the hopeless situation at our borders for over a year. The Health Secretary admitted it himself last week to the Health Select Committee that a strong border policy has to be part of planning for any future pandemics. It's time for government to finally get a grip on the border and stop new and dangerous variants delaying our freedoms, and to stop over-promising and under-delivering. Now let me finish by coming back to that word hopeless. We know now that the hopeless Prime Minister thinks he has a hopeless Health Secretary. But what I think is absolutely obvious now is that at points in this pandemic when people were getting sick, families losing loved ones and businesses going to the wall, this hopeless Health Secretary, the hopeless Chancellor and the hopeless Prime Minister have been more focused on playing politics in Downing Street, struggling to contain all of those egos in one room than they have been on the priorities of people in Luton North and across the country. When doctors and nurses were on COVID wards in bin bags because there wasn't enough PPE, when families had to have Christmases, Eid, New Year separated from the people they love, when families were grieving the loss of loved ones, Downing Street was in chaos, and the Prime Minister was not focused on them. He was instead focused on slating the Health Secretary on WhatsApp. I expect this from squabbling teenagers, not supposed leaders. People in Luton North and across the country deserve better than this. For this to be the final delay on our road back to freedom, this government finally needs to get a grip of both themselves and this virus. The British public have done their bit, but this hopeless government has been found wanting again.
Aaron Bradley.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I join you in congratulating my right honourable friend on her very well-deserved honour. She is a marvellous, marvellous example of a dame, and I've been very, very pleased to call her my right honourable friend. She and I know that the art of government and the art of being a minister is balance. It is taking conflicting lobby groups and interest groups and analysing them and assessing them and working out what is the right decision to take in the interests of the country. That's in the interest of the money that the government can spend, taxpayers' money, it's not our money, but also where the resources of government must go. And it's a very difficult job. That balance means that competing interests all come in and they all explain why their interest is the one that matters. And they're not interested as to whether the interest of someone else will be affected by their interest. And actually, ministers are probably doing quite a good job if nobody's terribly happy, because it probably means that they're catering to all interests a little bit. Now, my fear throughout this whole sorry saga of the pandemic, and I do pay tribute to the work that ministers have done. They have done an incredible amount of work and they have acted in the best interest of the country. But follow the science has become the mantra. And sometimes simply following the science is not enough, because the science is looking for one outcome and one single thing. And it is really reassuring actually to have heard ministers over the last few days say that we will have to accept that this is an endemic virus, that we will have to learn to live with it. Because there was a time that all we heard was that we would be actually eliminating this virus, and we simply can't do that. And I would ask that ministers think very hard about not just the science, but also the interests of people. Because we've been told for so long that we must do just essential activities. And for a long time, that was merely sleep, eat, drink, and possibly go out for an hour for exercise. Well, life is more than that. Life is so much more than the essentials. Life is those weddings with dancing and greeting loved ones. Life is being able to see loved ones in hospital when they are sick, something we've not been able to do throughout COVID. Life is about attending the British Grand Prix and many other occasions. Life is about the joy that you can get from these occasions and events. And that joy is we're constantly being told we can't have that joy because it will impact on the science. Now, the government has to start to celebrate and take advantage of the vaccine programme. We have got the most successful vaccine programme in the G7, something that I hope the Prime Minister, I'm sure the Prime Minister last week, reflected on. I'm very proud that in the North Staffordshire Clinical Commissioning Group, which I share with my honourable friend from Newcastle under Lyme, we have the highest level of vaccinations anywhere in the country. Yeah. We need to start to reap the benefits of that vaccine programme. Yeah. So with a heavy heart, I'm afraid to say to the Minister that I cannot support the government this evening, because I cannot find a way to explain to my constituents why the things they are looking forward to getting back to doing can have to wait. And I absolutely understand how it will have been put to the Minister. This Minister, it will cost lives. If you do not do this, Minister, this will cost lives. I understand that that's how it will have been put, but we have to accept that we cannot save every life. And I might have been able to be persuaded if the government was able to support those businesses that are unable to open. But that support is simply not there. The weddings industry, the hospitality sector, nightclubs. So I'm afraid that whilst I have a heavy heart, I will not be able to support the government, although I will on the procedural matters, which I will just say before I sit down, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, and like the member for Staffordshire Moorlands, I will not be supporting the government this evening, but I will not be with a heavy heart. It will be because I have a real conviction that what is being done and the approach that the government has made on this issue is wrong. And we have heard it again here today, and we heard it yesterday from the Prime Minister, that the very basis of pushing and promoting this policy is to instill fear into the hearts of people across the United Kingdom. Listen to the Prime Minister yesterday. We have to delay this because this new variant could kill people in ways we can't foresee or we don't understand. The same old message. If you do not obey these restrictions, then you're in danger either of dying yourself or your relatives dying, and you can't put your nose out the door, you can't do the things you want to do in normal life because there's a real danger you'll die. Even though, of course, the statistics show that even of those who contract coronavirus, a very small proportion, less than 0.3% actually died. And of those, even the World Health Organization has said that many of those deaths may not even be attributable to coronavirus anyway. If you'd been tested for coronavirus 28 days before you died in a car accident, you will still qualify as a coronavirus death. And so the statistics themselves have been even used in a way to try and reinforce the message of fear. Now, I want to just make 2 points here today, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The first is this, that if we follow the logic of what we heard from the Minister and the Prime Minister over the last 2 days, then we will never get away from the restrictions that we are living with at present. Because the Minister has admitted that we will have to live with coronavirus. And we know that the virus itself will mutate. So we're going to get different versions of it. And if we get different versions of it, we'll be told that this version is different than the last version, it's more dangerous, it's more contagious, it leads to more deaths, it leads to higher infection rates, or whatever. So there's justification for keeping the restrictions in place. And indeed, we heard from the Minister today not only the current restrictions, but we know that we're now going to have further restrictions in the future. If you work in the care sector, you're going to be forced to have a vaccination. He didn't answer the question, but I assume that if you visit anybody in hospital or a care home, you're going to have to prove you had a vaccination. And if you are a peripheral worker, are you going to have the vaccination? So we can see already that the government is thinking of people have accepted these restrictions. There will be other things in the future which are going to be forced on them. The second one is this, that the Minister said he was going to follow the data. Well, let me tell him some data. Unemployment in my constituency has gone up by more than 100% as a result of restrictions. Businesses are going under. Between now and what is called Terminus Day, many people will find their employment terminated, their business terminated, their livelihoods terminated, and for those reasons, I will not be voting for these restrictions tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I think throughout this process it's been heartbreaking, debilitating, wearing. So to be here again talking about a further 4-week extension is absolutely the worst possible outcome for so many of us. It's so disheartening. But I say this knowing that I will be supporting the government tonight, and I'm interested actually, unfortunately, to see that my constituency neighbour, the Honourable Member for Blakely and Broughton, is no longer in his place, because he made a very eloquent speech talking about why he couldn't support these measures on the grounds of civil liberties. And I wanted to remind him that about a quarter of his seat is actually in the city of Salford, where I was a councillor for a while. The city's motto is Salus Populi Suprema Lex, the welfare of the people is the highest law. The infection rates in Greater Manchester, which are some of the highest in the entire country, are highest in Manchester and Salford, which is what his seat straddles. So he cannot say that he's putting the welfare of the people in his constituency at the highest level. And from there, I just wanted to turn to actually something that was quite eloquently brought up by the Honourable Member for Luton North, where she was talking about wanting to get the politics out of this, and I completely agree with that. I do, which is why it was so frustrating yesterday that in the Manchester Evening News, the lead member for Health on Rochdale Borough Council was dismissing all of the vaccination programme as a gimmick and a slogan, and was talking about, hinting that the government was withholding vaccines from certain areas. I think anybody with the slightest idea about how logistics works knows that this is rate limited purely by supply. So what I would say to members is we've got 4 weeks to nail this down now. We can't have another extension. We can't keep going through this process, and we are going to have to work together. We're going to have to stop sniping at each other and trying to make little jibes and score a little point here or there. There are people who are depending on us to do the right thing now.
Thank you very much. Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And this extension is sadly necessary, so I'll be voting for it tonight. But once again, this government's failures have meant longer restrictions have become necessary, just as there's been more economic harm than should have been necessary, more human suffering than was necessary. Time after time, the government's got it wrong. Think back to last summer. Last summer, we had very low case levels. The experts said it was a chance to crush the virus. But the government did the opposite and cases spiralled out of control. In the autumn, as cases rose again, the government locked down far too late and released far too early, leading to tens of thousands of avoidable deaths. And now, when warned about the risk posed by new variants, the government refused to close the border, all because the Prime Minister wanted to go to India to pose with President Modi. Now, the government claims that only hindsight can spot this pattern, but that's simply not true. The government were warned time and time again. They ignored the warnings. In the words seemingly put into writing by the Prime Minister, it's been effing useless. But it's not funny. It's not a joke. So many people have lost their lives, and it's now necessary to elongate the misery further because of the government's unnecessary failures. Now, the government's now saying that we should, and I quote, live with it. Now, I don't agree. We should be suppressing the virus. That doesn't mean more lockdowns. To tackle this virus, the government should finally put in place the basic public health measures it has refused from day one. Alongside the vaccine, we need decent sick pay for people who need help to isolate. We need to kick out the profiteers from test and trace. We need to invest properly in local health teams to do effective tracing. The failure to sort out these public health measures has led to over 100,000 needless deaths, and it's prolonged economic suffering, and it's prolonged the curtailment of our lives. And if we don't suppress it now through test, trace, isolate and support, it risks hundreds of thousands more cases, many thousands more hospitalisations, with huge pressure on our National Health Service. Many more will suffer from long COVID. Already 400,000 are. It creates conditions for new variants, perhaps even those invulnerable to the vaccine. So I call on the government today to finally sort out sick pay at real living wage levels. Government ministers claim, I think it's very interesting, that the reason they refuse to properly financially support people to isolate when they have COVID is that they believe that people would abuse the system. It's no wonder, given how they behave, that they think so little of other people. Just because the Tory party is gaming the system to help their super-rich donors with these COVID contracts, it doesn't mean that working people should stoop to their level, and working people wouldn't stoop to their level. This government's failure to support people with COVID is a moral outrage, and it's creating a public health crisis of which this government should be ashamed. I'm voting for the extension tonight because it's necessary, but without government failure, it wouldn't have needed to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid that the former Speaker is going to be very disappointed, because we are going to have to live with COVID, like we have to learn to live with every other infectious disease that exists in the world. Yes, we try to suppress it. Yes, we try to deal with it, but we're going to have to learn to live with it. Viruses, you may be surprised to know, have been around 400 million years, a lot longer than us. Guess which one's winning the Darwinian race? Now, when we do have to make decisions, I think one thing is very clear, that up to this point, the aims of the medical profession and the government's advisors and the aims of the government have been broadly similar. But they're going to have to diverge at some point, because the medical profession will always want to see the rate of infection brought down to the smallest level possible at whatever cost. But the government has different considerations. The government needs to ensure that the rest of the health service is able to operate properly, that the economy is moving, and that the social and well-being of the population is looked after. That is why the aims are different. And while I'm at it, I have to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on a private note, I am sick to death of the government's so-called advisors coming on TV and giving their individual views rather than giving advice to the government on a confidential basis. If they want to be stars of Sky News, let them leave Sage and let them carve their own path. Now, on what basis will we decide when we have this divergence? Now, the first thing to say is that the variant is not going to be a reason for keeping lockdown, because the variant may be more transmissible, but that's irrelevant if it's not causing more hospitalisations or more deaths. And we already heard from Public Health England that the two vaccines, the Pfizer and AstraZeneca, can cope as well as with the new variant, the Indian variant, as they can with the Kent variant. So we don't need to hear about the variant argument, because I don't think it holds water. What matters is who is being hospitalised and where. Are the hospitalisations a result of young people who've not yet had the vaccine, who may be at risk because of the increased transmissibility of the new variant? Or is it people, as we've seen in some parts of the country, who have been offered the vaccine but for one reason or another chosen not to get it? What we cannot have is the country being held to ransom by any groups who have been offered a vaccine but have chosen not to take it. That is utterly unacceptable. Now, it seems to me that the essence of the government's case is this, and if my honourable friend wants to intervene to confirm it, it's this, that the government's strategy was based on a single vaccine strategy in the belief that if enough people got it, the efficacy was high enough that we could unlock at that point. But it seems to me that the evidence that was published by Public Health yesterday, Public Health England yesterday, that the Pfizer vaccine was 94% effective against hospitalisation after one dose, but AstraZeneca is only 71% after one dose and takes the second dose to get up to 92%. And it seems to me what the government are telling us, and I wish they would be clear about this, is that what they need is a little more time to get the people, especially with the AstraZeneca, to the second dose, to get the level of protection against hospitalisation that we have against Pfizer. If the government presented their case in this way, it would be an awful lot easier for the rest of us to give the government our support, because it would be a clear rationale for it. And the other thing I will say is this: we need to have a clear assurance that this 2-week review point is not a ploy to buy support in the House of Commons, but is a genuine review of the data, where we will see within a couple of weeks whether this hospitalisation rate is increasing or not. And if the government gives us a clear assurance that this 2-week is a real review and that we can achieve the full relief of the lockdown at that point, then Minster might be able to buy a little support from his own benches this evening.
Video link. Time since I've said that. Neil Hanvey.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Well, it feels like we've entered yet another episode of Hancock's Half Hour, but unfortunately, it's laughable for all the wrong reasons. The first motion on the debate today indirectly is relevant to Scotland and my Kirkcaldy Cowdenbeath constituency. And without independent Scotland will continue to suffer the consequences of UK government's hapless leadership on COVID. Travel agencies in my constituency have another month of pouring money down the drain and another month with no tangible support from government. That first motion is England only, so ALBA members will abstain on that principle. But to those who have suffered loss of life and bereavement, the government's response of repetitious, braggadocious claims at every juncture must be disheartening. It's more indicative, as I said earlier today, of a Del Boy Briting. Everything will be fine because we're British. It's precisely why we find ourselves in this position. This government have put political priorities over public safety. There's been a lack of action on border control at the start of the pandemic and with the identification of the Delta variant. They've allowed new variants to enter and seed, and the weekend's failure by the UK Prime Minister to lead the G7 to invest in vaccines and cash in line with World Health Organization's identified need is absolutely unforgivable. There has been an unwillingness to listen, to learn and respond. Chaotic messaging, abandonment of testing in March 2020, instead of using that nadir of the pandemic to expand testing. The Secretary of State has continued in his overconfidence in the field lateral flow test devices, and the chaotic education policy has only made things worse. There are continued huge gaps in support, driving poverty and disadvantage in the face of repeated warnings. And these are not just my concerns. Many have been raised in the prestigious British Medical Journal. Not every misstep can be mitigated by the effective work of Kate Bingham's Vaccines Task Force. Recently, the Secretary of State supported my calls for surveillance across a range of indicators to beat the virus. But vaccines are not foolproof. The G7 chair opportunity was an unforgivable moral failure. Vaccines, cash, but also robust international surveillance is urgently required. The government's growing propensity to ignore scrutiny of Parliament is absolutely staggering. And now the Honourable Member, Right Honourable Member for North Somerset, derides scrutiny of experts in the media. It's been never clearer than with their vote-dodging reduction in overseas aid, and that will not be forgiven. This is a global and dynamic challenge. The complete inadequate response from the G7 summit risks the development of ever more virulent variants. In light of that failure in leadership from the Prime Minister, can we get straight answers? Probably not. What action is the Secretary of State taking to secure our public health by working to meet those WHO targets for vaccines, cash and surveillance? Any return to normality will only happen when we're all safe. Thank you.
Robert Sims.
Point of order.
Point of order, Dr. Liam Fox.
Deputy Speaker, I wonder if it would be possible for you to convey to Mr. Speaker the need that while we are still in the restrictions we have in Parliament, we need to try to find ways when we are able to intervene with the contributions being done by video, because otherwise we are unable to challenge the sort of views of the Scottish nationalists who claim that the problems they suffer in the COVID pandemic are a result of the United Kingdom government's actions when they themselves have the same powers to deal with them in Scotland had they chosen to do so differently, but they haven't.
I'll make absolutely certain that the request that the Right Honourable Member has made is presented to the Speaker, and I'm sure that he will respond in his usual fashion. Sir Robert Sims.
The pandemic has been a massive challenge to the British government, and I happen to think that the Prime Minister and the senior ministers, given the uncertainties that they faced, have done a pretty good job. And they certainly, in terms of the vaccination programme, have proved to the world that Britain can go alone and can do a lot to safeguard its population when it uses its science and its ability to get things done. But I do still have the view, and when the roadmap was unveiled, I thought to myself, well, at least that stops me voting against the government again, until we get to the point when the government have delayed the opening up. I do think this is a matter of balance and a matter of judgment. My view is that most of the senior ministers who took this decision need a damn good holiday. Because if you actually look at the data, if you look at what's happening in the country, the restrictions are totally out of kilter with the sense of the problem. Let me take the southwest of England. There's 5.6 million people in the southwest of England.
Sorry, could you face, it's because your voice isn't being picked up by the microphone and Hansard can't hear you.
5.6 million people in the southwest of England. There are 23 people in hospital. There are 2 in ICU. In Dorset, where there's nearly 1 million people, we have 1 person in hospital. And yet, hundreds of couples that want to get married, businesses that want to be viable, people that want to get their lives back in order. I just think the balance is wrong. And we have most of the population now insulated with vaccination. We may not totally break the link between people going into hospital, but there's over 100,000 beds in the NHS. 1% are taken by COVID patients. Now, it might go up to 2%. We've already got experts on TV saying, well, in order for the NHS to catch up, we may well have to keep restrictions for longer. I just think this is unacceptable to the British people. I'm perfectly willing as a Conservative to accept restrictions when hundreds and thousands of people are dying and we're dealing with a virus that we don't understand. But we have sort of got to the point where we've won the battle. And there will be variants, there will be challenges, but I think we have to get on with normal life. And I think the points made by my right honourable friend, the member for North Somerset, are perfectly right. If it's simply because we need to get second doses in, if that has been explained, I think we might be a little bit more relaxed. But we're already hearing today, if you look at the explanatory notes, that actually it's a review of data in 2 weeks or in 4 weeks, not necessarily a release date. We need to get people's freedoms back. We can't save everybody, but what we've done is save thousands and thousands of lives. Now we need to safeguard employment, safeguard businesses, safeguard people's personal relationships. And as I started off by saying, I think the government have done a pretty good job. The vaccine programme is outstanding. We now have to take the dividend from that to get people back to normal life. When they queued up with their enthusiasm to get that jab in their arm, they thought that meant things would come back to normal. They did not expect that they would be within further restrictions going on and on and on. So I think the June the 21st, we should have lifted all restrictions. I hope and I pray that the government in 2 weeks' time look at the data again and set people free.
Venu Mishra.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Like many members who represent some of the highest infected areas during this pandemic, my own constituency of Stockport has been in a lockdown of some form for more than a year, along with the vast majority of Greater Manchester. While the people of Stockport have worked tirelessly to keep our community safe, they have repeatedly been let down by this government. As a result, thousands of workers risk losing their jobs as businesses struggle to survive with insufficient financial support packages, and an endless cycle of lockdowns and restrictions that has pushed our high streets to breaking point. I would also like to hear the Minister tell this House today why, 15 months into this pandemic, this government has failed to take any meaningful action to help businesses, schools and leisure facilities improve ventilation, when we have long known that this is an airborne virus. He will no doubt tell me that the Treasury has spent billions on furlough payments and support schemes, but businesses know the reality, namely that measures such as furlough payments are little more than a drop in the ocean when it comes to their bottom line and ability to plan long-term to survive this pandemic. Far more needs to be done if we are to avoid our economy nosediving and millions across the UK ending up unemployed. As we've heard today, the government has also repeatedly failed my constituents and millions of others around the country on the issue of healthcare. Indeed, we've already heard today what the Prime Minister really thinks of the Health Secretary, and perhaps it will be the only time in this House that I admit to agreeing with him. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are witnessing a crisis in our healthcare system, and the government cannot simply blame the pandemic. Indeed, in the months before the COVID crisis began, a source at Stepping Hill Hospital in my town told the Manchester Evening News that patients were, and I quote, stuck outside in ambulances with every corridor full of patients on trolleys and many forced to wait up to 24 hours to be seen for treatment. This is not the fault of NHS workers who have performed heroically throughout this pandemic. The blame must be laid squarely at the door of this government following a decade of chronic underfunding of our health service. The latest set of official NHS figures have revealed that record numbers of people are on hospital waiting lists across Greater Manchester. Stockport CCG, which covers my constituency, has more than 37,000 people waiting for vital hospital treatment. This is the highest level in the region, which is completely unacceptable. And this is compounded by the fact that most are having to wait at least 18 weeks for treatment. My constituents aren't alone. Across the country, more than 5 million people are now waiting for routine treatment, such as hip and knee operations, which is the highest level on record. COVID is, of course, a factor, but the reality is that this crisis had followed years of chronic underfunding by this Conservative government, and we are now unfortunately having to reap what they've sown. A further contributory factor in the rising number of infections is the scandalous lack of sick paper workers who are forced to self-isolate, feel unwell, or take time off to look after loved ones who are ill. They're being punished for following government guidance and in many cases are left with no alternative but to continue to work while potentially infectious due to lack of available support. A Unison North West survey recently revealed that 80% of care workers will continue to receive just £95 per week statutory sick pay if they are ill or following the government's advice to self-isolate or shield themselves or loved ones. The right thing to do would be to give them full pay. So I asked the Minister, does he accept that his government's failure to introduce proper financial support for people to self-isolate and proper sick pay has contributed to our failure to keep on top of the Delta variant and has led to delay in lifting lockdown restrictions we were expecting today? As the Prime Minister's former senior advisor recently said, fundamentally, there was no proper border policy because the Prime Minister never wanted a proper border policy. Our workers, businesses and most vulnerable in society are now paying the price for this wanton disregard of our nation's health. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I don't think anyone envies the task and the decisions that this government and this Prime Minister have to make. We've got a vaccination programme that's the envy of much of the world. 30 million adults now having had 2 jabs, 90% plus. Protection against hospitalisation from this Delta variant. We've also got a roadmap that was clear and linked to the success of that same vaccination programme. But against that backdrop, we're being asked to approve a further delay here today. I spoke to local health leaders in Cumbria and in Barrow and Furness over the last few days, and the message from them was clear. They support this delay. Our Director of Public Health was stark. Because we're trying to cover and backfill 5 million people on a NHS waiting list, even a small fraction of COVID patients going into hospital risk the NHS being overwhelmed. And so on that basis, and on the basis of the rationale put forward by the Secretary of State, I support these measures as one final push, one last heave before we return our freedoms. But we need to be absolutely clear about what this delay means. It extends impositions on our liberty, our livelihoods, people's health, and the future of young people. And while the state's got a duty to protect its citizens, our objective can't be 0 deaths. As my honourable friend from Penistone and Stocksbridge wrote so eloquently earlier this week, and I apologise for bastardising her words, we don't live to avoid death, we avoid to enjoy we live to enjoy life. And it has to be on that basis that we make the final judgment to unlock next month.
Would you allow me on that point? I'm extremely grateful. I'm listening to him very carefully, and it is the good argument for voting for these restrictions. Of course it is. But can I just say to him, has he considered the possibility that the NHS, very sadly now, is going to be under pressure for years dealing with this backlog?
My friend makes a very good point. I'm making the judgment based on my own local knowledge and that of my Director of Public Health, but we all have to make that decision in this place today. We can't afford for schools to close again, for young people to miss any more of their lives, or for any of our businesses to close as a result of further impositions. So it has to be one more heave to protect more people. And then we've got to accept that in the face of a virus that we are not going to get rid of and will continue to mutate and challenge us whilst we're on this earth, we've got to vaccinate as many people as possible and then give people back their freedom. Because there's a more fundamental issue at play here, which is public acceptance. We made a delicate compact with people over the last year. We restricted their liberties to keep them safe. And already we're seeing compliance with that law beginning to fray. We must accept that people expected their liberty to return as vaccinations were rolled out. But as we vaccinate more, acceptance of that compromise falls. If we can't maintain that compact, then our response to it has to change. So I hope and expect, with this final surge of vaccinations, when we return on the 19th of July to a society where people will be able to make their own choices. It's easy to sloganise about freedom. I, for one, am deeply uncomfortable about living in a country where we dictate to newly married couples whether they can cut their wedding cake or not. I believe this government has acted honourably and with good intention throughout this horrible pandemic. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm giving it my support tonight for one last heave to finish the job, and then we must return all of our freedoms on the 19th of July.
Point of order, Peter Bone.
I wonder if Mr Deputy Speaker could help me in regard to social distancing. There is not a single Labour member on the opposition benches. There's no SNP. There's no Liberal Democrats. There's no Plaid Cymru. Of course, there's a DUP. Would it be appropriate, because these benches are packed, for half of us to move over there to improve social distancing?
Well, I think, Peter Bone, if you have a look around, even on the Conservative benches, there are a few green ticks there. So I think, please stay where you are. Jim Shannon.
Speaker, I'd be very happy for the honourable member to come over here and join us on our side where we are here if he wishes to do so. I know we're in together in many things anyway. Can I just say, I do believe that we have to live with COVID-19 and the same as I get a flu jab every September, October of every year because I'm a diabetic and that's the way it is. Same way we'll get a COVID-19 jab come that time as well. And it's been a very long, hard road to recovery. And I think I want to put on record very clearly my thanks to government and to the Health Minister, Matt Hancock, and indeed to my own Health Minister, Northern Ireland, Robin Swan, for all that they have done to keep us safe over this last period of time. It was very important to put that on record. I understand that the weddings are seemingly an issue for many, and they certainly are for me and for my constituents as well in the hospitality sector. The wedding attendance is allocated via the risk assessment of the said venue. Self-distancing is to be absolutely critical to make that happen. And there are so many wedding venues that can increase their numbers and have extra numbers there because of the distance they can have when it comes to self-distancing. Weddings are the most significant day for couples, and there's nothing more heartwarming than seeing your guests smile with joy. The self-distancing has made that happen. Can I make a plea to the Minister for churches? I do it because I'm a regular church attender, but I do it for everybody else who also attends church and would like to do so. We know that we have to self-distance in church. We do know we have to wear a mask in church, and we understand that. But I'm just wondering, are we getting to the stage, Minister, where perhaps maybe it'll be a stage where we can attend church we don't have to wear a mask? Again, I ask it as a question. Is it possible, if we're adhering to the social distancing? For instance, when you go to a restaurant and you don't have to wear a mask, it seems a wee bit, perhaps maybe for churches that the same rules should apply. And I would request easement for the weddings in churches as well. Again, not every church would have the capacity for self-distancing, I understand, to have a wedding, but there are many who would. And I believe that there's a way forward safely to do that. Tourism is a crucial sector for our economy, where again the restrictions are blurred and many are left confused. And I just make this request again to government. The issue with tests and passenger locator forms are discouraging people from booking holidays, not to mention that Portugal was taken off the green list. I don't say it as a criticism to the Minister, but I just make the point that maybe we need more clarity in relation to that. And the focus needs to be on making travel more accessible and efficient to encourage those to travel, even if it is within the United Kingdom. A constituent of mine has recently left for work in the EU, where he was charged £85 for a PCR test. Not to mention the test requirements for when he comes home. Could I ask the Minister again if it's possible to review this approach, allowing lateral flow tests that are acceptable in our schools to be acceptable for travellers? I make the point for I believe this instills more efficient travel, where travellers can save money and travel with less hassle. I make a point as well, Mr Deputy Speaker, for those who are tour operators. And the buses, we know all the problems with the buses. They can't self-distance in the bus and then be a viable. But is there? And I would make a plea that if we're going to have it for another few weeks, which we are, I believe that'll be the intention of us here, that we can make sure that those businesses are protected and the jobs are secured. I also, Mr Deputy Speaker, in the short time left, make a plea for live music. For the live music, which I believe is crucial to many aspects of life in itself, for us personally, but also for the venues, for the hospitality sector, for weddings, for concerts. I appreciate there's always a risk of singing. I know when I sing, Mr Deputy Speaker, or Madam Deputy Speaker, the rain usually comes on. I think the Bible says about sing, make a joyful noise. When I make the joyful noise, it's never melodious, but it's always joyful. It's always loud as well. I would love to be able to sing in church again. It hasn't happened. It's not likely to happen in the near future. But I understand for those who are involved in live music that there's a real need to have that. So over the next 4 weeks, I just make the plea for businesses to ensure, as we move forward and move forward together, that we can ensure that those businesses can be protected and that they can ensure that they have the support that is needed through the furlough. I understand the vaccine rollout is a part of any moving forward, and I support that, and I welcome younger people getting their vaccine. And to me, this signal's been able to move forward safely, and this is what we need to do. So I fully support and fully appreciate the Prime Minister and Government are being careful and cautious. To use a saying that we use in Northern Ireland often, it is better to be safe than sorry, and it is better to be safe than sorry today. So I will be supporting Government and what they're putting forward, and both the votes that they come forward, because I believe it's right. I believe that we can do it for another 4 weeks, you know something, and we get to the end of that, and the vaccine there's more people in vaccine, and confidence will be restored. And if the confidence is restored, then I believe we must all be in a better place. I know that's not the opinion of some, but it's certainly my opinion and the opinion of some others in my party as well. So I want to ensure that Government support it, and I'll be supporting it tonight as well. Thank you.
I want to discuss two sides of the science, both science as the liberator and science as the captor. We've seen through this process new vaccines have been created using messenger RNA, completely new type, that will serve us well, I'm sure, globally into the future. We've created and rapidly tested them, rapidly rolled them out, and that is all to the real good. We've repurposed existing drugs, such as the steroid, very cheap steroid, dexamethasone. We've used antivirals that were used before, remdesivir being just one, and we've discovered new treatments like monoclonal antibodies. We've created a testing regime that enables us to rapidly test vast numbers of the population for their COVID status. Now, these were the new tools that I'd hoped would prove science as the liberator. And the results were extremely good. Let's look at those facts again. We've heard them many times, but I think they're worth putting on the record once more. With just one dose of any of these vaccines, protection's good. With 2 doses, it's truly exceptional, at over 90% protection against hospitalisation. And even those that do find themselves in hospital after vaccination are generally not finding themselves dreadfully unwell. So we've seen hospitalisations reduced. We've got less than 1,000 people in hospital, or 1,000 thereabouts. Just 1% of NHS capacity. And I'm sure ministers would respond to that, saying that's the way they want to keep it. But I'm afraid the argument will never end. We've got a death rate of about 10 deaths per day out of a background death rate in the country of 1,100 per day, currently under the usual average. But let's look at those 10 deaths within 28 days of a positive COVID test. Their husbands, their wives, their brothers, their sisters, their parents, their friends. Each is a tragedy, each is a family loss, each is a dreadful event. But surely, with such low levels, we should now be provided with the data as to why. What were the deeper underlying reasons behind those deaths? And I certainly hope ministers have been provided with that information. Because there's a world of difference, and a difference of interpretation that this place would make between the death of a young, fit person and somebody with comorbidities, perhaps in a hospice with life-threatening conditions. Let's examine science as the captor. Our ability to sequence the genome is incredible. The UK is a world leader. Hundreds of variants have been discovered, and doubtless once the Delta variant has passed through, just as the Alpha Kent variant has been and gone, we'll discover more. Will it be a Californian one, a Buenos Aires one, the Epsilon, the Zeta, and I'm sure we'll simply run out of Greek alphabet before and over the coming months. But each one causes hysteria. The media go berserk. The scientists are like having the decorator in your house. You get sucking of teeth, shaking of head, and you know there's bad news around the corner. We've seen modelling. The 5 key modellers have come up with a roadmap that published in February that the government understood and led to the roadmap we're on. But every one of our figures are better than that. And that makes this statutory instrument so unintelligible. I would rather trust the people. What if we were to go for freedom on the 21st of June? What would I do? Because I think I'm just pretty normal. Would I be throwing away my mask in the supermarket? I very much doubt it. I carry the sterilising gel in my pocket, and I can say to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, that more alcohol goes through my hands on a daily basis than a night out with George Best and Oliver Reed. Would that stop? No, it won't. The public outside of this bubble have already moved on. They've broadly given up on these petty, fogging rules. We should trust the public, and I will not be supporting the government this evening.
Miss Green.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government asserts that it does not have a zero COVID policy or a zero COVID strategy. Well, if I accept that that is the case, it does seem as though it's a 0.1 COVID strategy. It's almost zero, but not quite. The government also at the same time accepts that the disease is endemic. And this is a very curious position where it's endemic, but the government is still trying to get the disease as close to zero as possible, which I would suggest requires pretty robust action from the government for the long term. Now, the original lockdown was to flatten the curve and protect the National Health Service. And even though the Nightingale hospitals were soon mothballed and then closed, that was not enough. Lockdown was then intended to enable test, track, trace, and isolate to get up to speed, and it must surely be there now. But again, that was not enough. Then it was to vaccinate the most vulnerable, the over 50s, or the most frail in our society. This is when the narrative was that the first dose would provide the vast majority of the protection required, far better than the influenza jab, and that the second jab at that point was only really to give a longevity to the resistance to COVID that would be required. Now, this should have, and the expectation was that at that stage, this would cut the overwhelming majority of deaths and hospitalizations, and this is the case, but still, that was not enough. Then it was to have everyone then given the second dose. That's almost been achieved, but as the Secretary of State announced a short while ago, the rollout of vaccinations now is intended for 21-year-olds. They can now sign up to get the vaccine. And again, this seems not to be enough. Now, in Bolton, we've been through a very difficult time. There's been an amazing amount of good work, hard work from so many locally. But with this new Indian variant, or variant of concern, we coped. And the impact on our health service was far less than the peak in January earlier this year. The NHS held up, and I believe it's quite clear now that the link between transmission, hospitalisation and death has been severed. And again, this is not enough to find our lockdown terminus. The narrative in recent weeks seems to have shifted from initially being about dealing with the Indian variant and seeing how risky and dangerous that was to the country. I think the evidence that's available at the moment shows we can cope with it. But the position seems to be shifted from dealing with the Indian variant and trying to understand it to now offering every adult 18 and over the first dose. As night follows day, this will still not be enough. The Health Secretary has been downplaying to some extent earlier this week the value of the first dose and promoting the value of the second dose. So should we now be anticipating a shift later in the year for every adult to be offered that second dose as well? That takes us well into September, perhaps a little beyond. We can see the rolling of the pitch for child vaccinations, compulsory vaccination of certain co-workers and perhaps others, the rolling of the pitch for, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Honourable friend and neighbour in Greater Manchester, could he reflect briefly for the House on his experience in Bolton and the declining case rates?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this important point. Transmission in Bolton is clearly on the way down. This demonstrates the actions taken and the effect and impact of this particular variant of concern, which had more impact in Bolton than almost anywhere else in the country. It's on the way down. This should give reassurance to the country that we can cope without a further extension to these measures which are having such an impact on so many people. We just think, for example, about the 5 million waiting list for hospital treatment, which would be far longer if people had better access to GPs to get those referrals. So when I ultimately think about what's going on, I was going to mention as well the G7 is suggesting a global vaccine program as well. Would we have to wait until that's been delivered? Because until everyone is safe, no one is safe. So when the Prime Minister refers to a terminus, I fear he doesn't mean the end. I fear he's thinking more of a bus terminus, where we end one journey to start another, and there'll be another vehicle to impose another lockdown extension.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And when I have confronted these votes over the last 9 months, I have done my best to look at the entire health needs and the entire health case of all of the nation, not just those that unfortunately have been struck down with COVID. So last year, when it came to the 10 p.m. curfew, I looked at that and felt it didn't make sense from a health perspective to see everyone leaving the pub at the same time, and so I voted against that. But when it came to the decisions towards the end of last year and into January, I could see the hospitalisation cases, I could see the need to get the vaccine rolled out, and so I supported the government. So where are we now? Well, let's look at the hospitalisation cases. We were at a level of 35,000 COVID inpatients, clearly the NHS struggling to cope. When the academics at Imperial College modelled what Freedom Day, being the 5th of July as they modelled it, would look like in terms of hospital numbers, they came up with a figure of 7,000. Warwick University came up with 1,750. The figures of COVID inpatients are currently under 1,000, so better than expected. In the combined county of Sussex, with 1.6 million residents, there are 6 COVID inpatients. In my own county of East Sussex, there are 2 from those 6. And interestingly, they didn't present with COVID. They didn't get admitted because of COVID. They just got tested whilst they were being admitted and were found to have COVID and included in the numbers. So the hospitalisation numbers are looking much better. The NHS now has the resilience. But what is striking to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, are the numbers of people who are waiting to have their lives enhanced by elective treatment. 5 million people in England alone are waiting for surgery. Over 400,000 of those have been waiting over a year. Prior to COVID, that figure was 1,600. So that demonstrates what restrictions do to the wider health impact on people. Those people deserve a life too. They deserve to be looked after. There shouldn't be an apartheid system when it comes to our health service. And what about the vaccine? What a great success. We should be basking in the vaccine dividend that this government has delivered. In my constituency, actually in East Sussex as a whole, of the cohorts 1 to 9, which we know are 99% of the mortality, we have 85% double dosed. And we know that that vaccine is effective against all known strains. So we are there. But the difficulty is that we are not willing to confront the concept of living with COVID. Ministers say that we have to live with COVID, and yet we're given another month on top. And the arguments the ministers use as to why we need that extra month will still be there in a month's time. And at that point, we're going to have to decide where we are going to jump. And I spoke to one of the very senior NHS leads who has university-age children, and he said to me, and I wrote it down, "Too many of us making decisions have forgotten what it feels like to be a 20-year-old or how miserable it is to be a 20-year-old right now." Those lives of young people that have made great sacrifices to help the cohort 1 to 9 that I talked about, they have made those sacrifices. They need to see a return. They need to see the return this summer. And whilst ministers may say there are just a few restrictions remaining, we will not start tackling the backlog in NHS waiting times on elective surgery. We will not start tackling the mental health crisis, and particularly in young people, is being suffered with such great detriment. We need to tell the country that we've turned the corner, thanks to them, thanks to this vaccine dividend, and we're now ready to accept the risk and move on. It's about everyone's lives, not just certain lives.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a great pleasure to follow my honourable friend from Bexhill and Battle. And like him, I have followed the journey of sometimes voting with the government on these restrictions and sometimes voting against. It's unusual, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be able to say you agree with the previous speaker, because the previous speaker is nearly always from the opposition benches. But of the 51 speakers today, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this debate, only 5 are Labour backbenchers.
Outrageous.
And this, Madam Deputy Speaker, is one of the most important debates. It is about the freedom and liberty of the British people. Now, of course.
Do you not find it rather odd that not only is there an absence of members from the opposition, but in fact these restrictions, and the government is only comfortable getting these restrictions through because they have the support, the comfortable support of the Labour Party, and yet most of the speakers from the Labour Party who have spoken here today have condemned the government for its actions.
Madam Deputy, I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend from across the aisle. And he, of course, has been here for the whole debate. But this is about the liberty of the British people. We're taking away what is our right. So, for instance, I'm due to go to a wedding, but I can't have a group of friends round my house beforehand because there'd be too many. When I get to church, I can't sing. Well, I can't sing anyway, but I'm not allowed to sing. Then I can't dance at the wedding.
You can't dance either.
And I can't dance either. But more importantly, as the evening drags out, I can't then go to a nightclub to boogie the night away in celebration. And then the following day, I can't go for a park run to run all these problems off. So I might need to call a doctor, but I can't go and see a doctor because he won't do face-to-face appointments. It is withdrawing our very liberty. Now, I'm a great fan as a Prime Minister, and I think most on these benches are. He came to lead the Conservative Party at the end of the Bercow Parliament, when Parliament was in chaos. He took us through a general election. He won a mandate. He delivered Brexit. He dealt with the awful COVID pandemic. He led the world with the vaccine programme. And yet tonight, unfortunately, I can't support him. Because I think every member has to put the country first, the constituency second, and their party third. Now, as you will appreciate, Madam Deputy Speaker, in my opinion, on most occasions, all those three are in line. But this time, I don't think the government has made the case for putting off unlocking. Now, with apologies to Mark Twain, there are lies, damn lies, and COVID statistics. And the government has been using an extraordinary propaganda machine to take certain statistics to try and prove their case. But if you look at other statistics, as mentioned already, the total number of deaths at the moment are running below the 5-year average. As the previous member said, he has very few cases in his area. In Northamptonshire, thankfully, in our 2 hospitals, we have 0 COVID patients. And we haven't had a death for 5 weeks because of COVID. And the government's own original forecast for what would happen on May the 17th when we did the major unlocking, their forecast, we have done better than their best prediction of the situation. So why now have we gone into this doom and gloom? And I have no doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we were in opposition, our benches would be packed.
Yeah.
And there'd sort of be a blonde guy, fairly chubby and a bit, as scruffy as me, jumping up and down and making the case why we should get rid of these restrictions. I know it's a balance, and I know people have to make a choice. But we as Conservatives believe in personal responsibility and common sense. And if I actually went back to my original example, of course I wouldn't go into a busy nightclub. Of course I wouldn't have 100 friends round. But that would be my decision, not the decision of the state. So unfortunately, tonight, as much as I like the Prime Minister, I think he's got it wrong, and I'm going to vote against.
Mark Harper.
Deputy Speaker, and can I just draw attention to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests as Chair of the COVID Recovery Group. And before I turn to the matters before us, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to put on record my thoughts about the loss of Joe Cox 5 years ago. I remember, sadly, that day very well, and you and I were both in different roles at that time, and it was our joint responsibility as, in my case, the Government Chief Whip, and yours as the Opposition Chief Whip, to ensure that this House was able to be recalled and for appropriate tributes to be paid to Jo Cox and her memory. And I know you're in your position unable to speak often in the House, but it was a great pleasure working with you on a very sad occasion to make sure that there was a fitting tribute paid. And I remember that day, sadly, very well. On a happier note, in one sense, I'd like to also put on record my thanks to Sir Roy Stone for his 44 years of service in the civil service, which will shortly come to an end, although I'm told he's not retiring. He's going to turn his attention to other things. He was a fantastic principal private secretary to me when I was Government Chief Whip, and I know his loss will be felt across government. Turning, Madam Deputy Speaker, of course.
Can I just take this moment, Madam Deputy Speaker, to put on record my apologies to my right honourable friend, who was Chief Whip through a period where I was leading various rebellions, and also to say a great apology to Roy Stone, who will also have had to put up with the trouble that I caused my right honourable friend. I'm very grateful for the things that he said.
Well, my honourable friend reminds us all, Madam Deputy Speaker, how sometimes we can have different roles in this House. And it's worth just noting that as a former Government Chief Whip, I don't find not supporting the government a particularly comfortable place to be. But as my honourable friend, the member for Wellingborough, said, sometimes you have to put your what you believe to be the interests of your country first, and that's what I feel I'm doing. Just drawing attention to what my honourable friend from Bolton said, he's right. There are documents in government. I'm not saying these have been agreed by ministers, but it's certainly advice being given to ministers that government should aim to have a very low prevalence of COVID, which isn't zero COVID, but it's not a great distance away. Now, if ministers were to agree to that strategy, it would mean restrictions going on for the foreseeable future. And that's one of the things that we're very concerned about. But I want to focus my remarks, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I do note at this point, again, what my honourable friend said, the Labour benches are somewhat empty. The back benches are completely empty, and it is colleagues on this side of the House who are holding the government to account, which I accept the government may occasionally find uncomfortable, but it is our role as members of Parliament. I also find it helpful to draw attention to the documents actually before us. And we have, for those that don't know, an explanatory memorandum which explains what it is we're voting on today. This has been prepared by the Department of Health and Social Care. It will have been approved by a Minister of the Crown. And it's very clear. It's worth reading. 7.3, bullet 2, makes it clear that the government will likely be able to offer a first dose of vaccine to all adults by July, but the vaccinations themselves will probably not take place until August due to supply constraints. And of course, we know it takes 2 or 3 weeks until those vaccinations are effective. So actually, those adults won't actually be protected until later in August. So that means this delay is therefore pointless, or alternatively, we're not going to be ceasing these restrictions on the 19th of July if vaccinating all adults is the goal. If you then turn to the review dates and whether this is indeed a terminus, 7.4, 7.5, 7.6 and 7.7 are very interesting. There's a review required by the Secretary of State every 35 days. The first review, according to this, isn't due until Monday the 19th of July. No mention here of an early review after 2 weeks. The first review due by Monday the 19th of July. England, it says, will remain at step 3 for a further 4 weeks, subject to a further review. And it also says that the purpose of extending these regulations, the primary purpose, is to gather more evidence that the tests can be met. Not that these rules will expire after 4 weeks, never to be reintroduced. It's to gather evidence for tests to be met and then a decision to be taken about whether these restrictions are to continue. The second reason given is to allow more people to receive a vaccination, further reducing the risks, which ministers have said. But as I previously just pointed out, the first doses are not going to be delivered until August. So that makes no sense. Something doesn't add up here, and it's because we're concerned that these regulations are not going to end on the 19th of July. Of course.
I'd like to thank my Roger friend for giving way. Would he, in the context of timetables and how things are going to pan out in the near future, now it's the government's intention to ensure the vaccination of a very large number of co-workers, which this is going to take legislation, presumably. It's going to take a period of time for them to have the vaccination, perhaps a second vaccination, and to deal with all the other problems. If this is a requirement for the government to be able to deliver a kind of exit from lockdown, how long will that take?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a very good point, and it's part of the reason why we're concerned. If this was genuinely going to be the end of it, that would be one thing, and I've listened carefully to the members that have spoken. A number have said that they will support the government on this occasion, but this is it. And I'm afraid we have heard that before, and it has turned out not to be true. And I'm afraid, just reading the documents in front of us, that is why I have some scepticism. The final thing I would say is just for, and I hope that the Minister that's winding up the debate, who I have a great deal of respect for, can clarify this. I'm not quite sure about what's going to happen at the end here, because the review of the evidence that's being gathered about whether the tests are met isn't due to be done until the 19th of July. So I'm not clear about when ministers are going to come to Parliament to set out whether those 4 tests have been met. Is it going to be on the 19th of July, or is it going to be before the 19th of July? I'm not clear whether they're going to give that 1 week's notice. All the way through the roadmap so far, we've had 4 weeks, then a week's notice. So I'm not quite clear about the timetable, and it's important because, as has been said in the debate, people's lives will now be reoriented around that new date. Weddings, family events, people's plans, and it's important that our constituents know what it is that they're going to expect. When can they expect a decision? When can they expect to know what their life is going to look like? And it's because of those concerns, Madam Deputy Speaker, concerns about whether these regulations really are the end, that I will, I'm afraid, be voting against them this evening. And my final point is the motion about proceedings in this House. It is my strong view that Parliament, whilst it's been welcome that we've been able to have Parliament meet through a pandemic, and thanks should go to all of the parliamentary staff that have made that possible, it is, I think, indisputable that this Parliament in its current form is not as effective in holding the government to account and enabling us to do our job as Parliament should be. And I think we should get back to as far as normal as possible in this House as fast as we can. And it's for that reason I will also be voting against the motion to continue these proceedings effectively until we return in September.
First of all, I would like to thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his kind words about how closely we worked together after the tragic murder of Joe Cox. I much appreciated the work that we did together at that terrible time. And I'd also like to echo his words about Sir Roy Stone, who I saw this afternoon, to say how much I had always valued the advice he gave to me when I was Opposition Chief Whip. We now go to Sir John Redwood.
It is time to trust people more. It is time to control people less. I would like to praise ministers and officials, and particularly all those scientists, medics and researchers who have worked so hard to make sure that the UK is a leader in vaccines, supplying one of the best vaccines to the world, getting it out early and making it available for all of us, making sure that we had bought in other vaccines that became available so that we were in a position to protect our population well and relatively early compared with other countries. And I pay tribute to all the work that has gone on by the NHS and the medics to understand how to treat the disease better, how it is transmitted, so that we can take better actions to give people greater security. So I say now to all these experts, to the NHS, to the government, share what is relevant with the rest of us, the public, and let us make more of our own risk assessments. Because we are now saying to people that there are two major ways in which we can all protect ourselves against the possibility of getting this or getting a bad version of it. We're making 2 jabs available to all adults who want them, and the figures so far show that that gives you a much better probability of not catching the disease at all, and it gives you very strong protection against a serious case of the disease, which is what we're mainly worried about, because we're trying to stop people dying, we're trying to stop people struggling in intensive care, we're trying to stop that pressure on the NHS and all the suffering that it produces. But we're also saying to people, if you're still worried about the residual risk, or if you really don't like vaccines, you yourself can self-isolate. And I hope the government will continue, as an employer and as the government, guiding others in the economy, to say that we should be generous and supportive of anyone who really does feel they need to protect themselves against the virus by self-isolation. But I think we're now well beyond the stage where we have to isolate practically everybody else to some extent, when so many people now have protection and so many people are making their own risk judgments and want to get on with their lives. In that room, when assessing the data, it's most important that we look at all the data about jobs, livelihoods, incomes, family stress, mental health pressures, because this is creating all of those. So I think the government can do more, but I think what the government should be doing is it should be helping the private sector to manage airflows and air extraction and ultraviolet cleaning and so forth, to make it safer for many more social contact businesses to reopen and have a reasonable number of people enjoying their services. I think more could be done on making sure that all our health settings have really great infection controls. We don't want any more slippages from health settings themselves. I would urge the government to think again about an idea they looked at early on, but then didn't develop, which is why in the large populated areas, particularly the big conurbations, we can't have an isolation hospital that deals with COVID and other very infectious diseases well away from the general hospital, because I think you add to the pressures and likelihood of cross-infection if you have a general hospital taking in a very infectious disease. But I do think now there is huge scope to get a really good economic recovery, to save some jobs, to create some new jobs, to get pay up, to have many more transactions in the economy. But to do that, we need to relax and we need to trust the people more. I think my constituents are ready to make decisions about their own lives again. Many are very frustrated they're not allowed to. We have all this great advice, we have all this great knowledge. Let's not get too gloomy and let's not lock everybody up again.
As colleagues will be aware, there have been quite a few interventions, so after the next speaker, I will have to take the time limit down to 3 minutes in order to get everybody in. Gareth Bacon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will be supporting the government this evening, but on this occasion, my support is heavily qualified. Like many of my constituents, I'm disappointed that Stage 4 of the government's roadmap for reopening has been pushed back to the 19th of July. But like I believe the majority of them, I understand the reasoning for the 4-week delay. The government have consistently stated that the roadmap marks the 21st of June as the earliest opportunity to end restrictions, not a date set in stone. But it's clear that the Delta variant has changed the race between the virus and the vaccine. If we only face the Alpha variant, then the extraordinary level of first doses the NHS has delivered would undoubtedly have been enough for us to be fully reopening next week. But 2 jabs are needed for the highest level of protection against the dominant Delta variant. Understandably, I believe, this means that the NHS needs more time to fully vaccinate more people before ending restrictions. However, I do share concerns that one more short delay may in fact lead to many more. There is a risk that the government's decision-making process is becoming too cautious in the face of the next wave of coronavirus. If that happens, we may miss our chance to fully reopen in the summer before the trickier autumn and winter months. While I believe my constituents can stomach a short delay, the government must provide assurances that this delay will be the final hurdle. Coronavirus is not going anywhere. We will have to learn to live with it and the risk it poses to public health, just like we do with the flu. The government must hold its nerve and let the vaccines do their job. It shouldn't be afraid of its own success. The NHS vaccination programme has been a resounding triumph. In my own constituency of Orpington, nearly 100,000 people have been vaccinated, thanks to the tremendous effort of the local NHS staff and volunteers. Almost 60,000 of these jabs have been administered in the Orpington Health and Wellbeing Centre, which marked 6 months as a vaccination centre this week. Data shows clearly that the vaccines that we have available are successful in combating all known variations of the virus. As these vaccine numbers continue to increase, it will therefore be impossible to explain any further delay. This delay has serious economic ramifications, especially for small businesses. For example, the 100% business rate relief for retail, hospitality and the leisure sector is due to end on the 30th of June. Employer contribution changes to the CJRS are due to take effect on the 1st of July. Many businesses that are unable to fully reopen are now faced with paying bounce-back loans. The government therefore needs to set out what support businesses can expect as a result of this delay, and we also need to know what proportion of people need to be vaccinated to sever the ties between cases and hospitalisations. How many more adults, therefore, need to be fully vaccinated? And the government's plan to deliver these vaccines in time so that we can reopen on the 19th of July. If the government can provide this detail, it will go a long way to calm worries that restrictions will go on and never be lifted. That's why I hope the government will now set out in detail what needs to happen in the next 5 weeks so that we can finally and fully reopen on the 19th of July.
As has been noted by my colleagues, there are very few Labour backbenchers taking part in this debate, particularly the point made by my honourable friend from Wellingborough. Now, their Labour colleagues are not bad people, they're not lazy, but they're not interested in, as we are, in freedom. And this whole debate is a mortal threat. It's a mortal threat to the Conservative Party, and this is proven by history. When we had a wartime regulation controlled economy between 1939 and 1945, it led to a Labour landslide. People get used to controls, and at the end of July, and this is going to go through today, obviously, but at the end of July, there must be an entire reset of the Conservative government. We must be talking about freedom, civil liberties, trusting business, not subsidising business. That is what low taxes, that is what the Conservative Party is about. Let's look at the data. In Lincolnshire, sadly, we've had one death, but only one death in the last month. We've got a population of 651,000 adults. 504,000 have had their first jab. Of those, 400,000 have had their second jab. 95% of over 70s have had 2 jabs. 75% of over 50s in Lincolnshire have had 2 jabs. There's no reason for Lincolnshire to be under any restrictions at all, but I accept that we are one country. But I don't know why, if we have to have controls, we can't have regionalised controls. The government must act according to reasonable proportionality. Our job as backbenchers is to scrutinise the executive. But how can we scrutinise the executive when we don't know what the goal of the executive is? There's been too much shifting of goalposts, too many fatuous rules based not on science but on populism. Our society should be free and open, and there's a real danger the public would increasingly ignore this. The government will be a government of the emperor without clothes. Of course, the public, in large part, support these further controls, but what about business? Business is being driven into the ground, and you don't support business as by endless subsidies you let business get on with business. And this is never going to end. At the end of this month, there'll be another variant. It'll come from, darkest Peru, the Peruvian variant, and Paddington Bear will be arrested in Paddington Station because he's at risk of put in quarantine. It'll go on and on and on. It's a bit of a cliche now, but the fact is we're never going to eradicate this disease. It's like no other disease. It's going to constantly vary. It's going to constantly attack us. We just have to learn to live with it. And we have to base our policy not on the number of infections, which will rise and fall and probably keep rising with every new variant. Our policy is to save the NHS. Our policy is to protect the NHS, to stop the NHS falling over. There's only one policy that makes sense at the end of July, and that is if the NHS is in danger and if hospitals are in danger of becoming overfull. That should be our policy.
Tim Lawton. Happy Sussex Day, Madam Deputy Speaker, and like every good horny-handled son and daughter of Sussex, I'm afraid I won't be druv into the government lobby this evening. Madam Deputy Speaker, hashtag I'm done. That was the overwhelming message on social media on Monday when Independence Day, so tantalisingly close, was cruelly whipped away from our constituents again. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm done with making excuses to my constituents for when their lives might just get back to some degree of normality. We are constantly told it is about data, not dates. Quite right. Well, we have the imminent dates by which the vaccination programme will have achieved effective herd immunity well ahead of what was imagined when the lockdown route map was designed. Now 80% of adults having had their first dose. We've had the data showing that the Pfizer vaccine is 96% effective against the Delta variant after 2 doses, and the AstraZeneca one 92%. We have the data showing an average of 9 deaths a day at the moment and 1,136 hospitalisations, a world away from where we were at the start of the roadmap. We've had the data from Public Health England that only 3% of Delta variant cases had received 2 vaccinations. And we also had the dodgy data from 3 modelling studies from the University of Warwick, Imperial College and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine showing widely different scenarios, with the most pessimistic warning that the UK could experience a further 203,000 deaths by next June, around 50,000 more than the first and second waves combined. Yet how can that be when we know the vaccine works and data shows a likely 90% take-up rate? Yet it is these doomsday models by largely anonymous wonks with no remit for considering the impact of further lockdown on life at large that seem to trump all the other data, and the government puts them on a pedestal above all others. They are confusing modelling for scientific forecasts. I'd be delighted.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Is my honourable friend saying really that the scientists are just concentrating on one thing and ignoring everything else?
Well, the trouble is there are lots of different scientists and they don't agree with each other, and it's only certain scientists who seem to have an impact on the government, and it usually is the most doomsday of those scenarios. So where is the data that shows allowing 6 people inside a pub has increased infection rates, and by how much? Where is the data that shows how much faster the infection has spread, because up to 30 people have been able to meet outside since the original journey out of lockdown? Where's the data showing that the NHS is being overwhelmed not by COVID patients, but by a huge increase in children and families suffering mental illness, including many worrying episodes that we've seen as constituency MPs, or by the surge in advanced cancer cases that could not be diagnosed and treated early? Where's the data showing how many businesses, particularly in the hospitality sector, cannot wait a further 4 weeks to be profitable and will likely now fail, with the accompanying impact on people's jobs and livelihoods and well-being? And where is the data showing the impact on the well-being of children now denied sports days for another year, school proms, students again denied graduation ceremonies for a second year, having missed out on so much of their university experience? And where's the data on the impact of domestic abuse that has risen so much, we've seen? Where's the data showing the continued impact on babies? The problem is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the only data considered seems to be exclusively the worst case scenarios about the spread of COVID, regardless of the current single figure average death rates. No COVID strategy is risk-free, but a further delay is by no means a victimless decision. It's time that we trusted people to live with COVID, just as the Prime Minister announced in February, in the same way that we live with flu, but we don't let flu get in the way of living our lives. And the government promised at that stage that we would move to personal responsibility. My fear is that the government continue to try to nanny people. They will just not take any notice, and then no amount of retained rules will make any difference. People are already increasingly making their own risk assessments. As somebody tweeted the other day, I've had COVID, I have antibodies, I've had both jabs, I've worn a mask, I've sanitised to within an inch of my life. I've done no more, it's over. My fear is that this will become a much more widely held view if the government just keep delaying Freedom Day without the evidence to back it up.
Just to say, I really don't mind interventions taking place, but at this stage we've got 13 people to get in before I start the wind-ups. So every intervention means that somebody is not going to get in. And I would urge people actually to be less than 3 minutes if they can. Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think in all the difficult judgments the House has had to make during the pandemic, this is perhaps one of the most difficult, and I entirely respect the arguments of those who've spoken already in this debate and who've come to a different conclusion than I have. This is, of course, as ever, a balance of risks, in this case between the Delta variant and the risks of ongoing restrictions, which are not insignificant. And we have to ask ourselves what's changed since the last time we looked at the roadmap and at its end point. The government's strategy has not changed. It remains to vaccinate, prioritising the most vulnerable. And that cannot require everyone to be vaccinated. That's neither scientifically necessary nor practically achievable. The significant change is what an effective response to the Delta variant now seems to require, that being 2 doses of vaccine, not just 1. And I do see the significance in that of the difference between the 57% of the adult population with 2 doses now and the 76% we should reach by the 19th of July. And that argument allows me just to support the government tonight. But I want to make 2 other points. The first is that the logic of this extension is to protect the NHS from a significant increase in hospitalisation from COVID-19. And this protection comes at a high cost to the economy and to the rest of society. So we need to take full advantage of it. And whether that's in reducing the backlog of treatments for other medical conditions or in giving NHS staff a break before what may be another difficult winter, I think it would help if ministers can explain what we are doing with the time and space this extension is buying us. And the second point is this. I, as others have been, am extremely concerned about what recent decision-making tells us about our collective tolerance of risk. Scientists and ministers alike have told us that we are going to have to live with COVID indefinitely, but we don't know what that means, if not the acceptance of ongoing risk of illness and even death. And we do not understand what tolerable risk looks like. The roadmap had 4 stages, no more. And if the logic of this extension to the last stage is to allow greater vaccination, then when that is achieved, we must be able to say the restrictions will be lifted so that businesses and individuals can at long last start to plan with certainty. Anything else will move us from risk management to risk aversion. And risk aversion has consequences broader than the management of the pandemic. Appetite for risk, for example, is a crucial ingredient of innovation and invention. Ironically, the things that have delivered the vaccines and the progress we've made against COVID so far. So despite my reservations, I will support the government tonight, but I want a commitment to use that period of extra restrictions wisely and a firmer commitment to end restrictions on the 19th of July.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This great country is the cradle of freedom. For over 8 centuries, at least since the time of Magna Carta, this mother of parliaments has protected rights and liberties of the British people. I, together with many others in this place, have been deeply troubled by the temporary restrictions that we have asked the British people to observe and the sacrifices we have asked them to make. I have supported every COVID decision to date with a clear sight of the need to tackle the virus that was rampaging through Gloucestershire and the UK, and hospitalisations and COVID deaths were a serious daily threat. My heart continues to go out to everybody who has lost loved ones. Yet, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are in a very different situation now, and I cannot support a confused further delay of the roadmap in these circumstances. Now is the time to trust the British people. We've heard that a lot tonight. We must trust them to continue acting with the caution, and we must trust them to make choices to protect the health of their friends, family and loved ones. I am proud of how the people and businesses of Stroud, the Valley and Vale have supported their neighbours. They have volunteered in their thousands and put themselves forward for vaccinations and all to regain their historic freedoms, to stay well and get back to some form of normal. And in Stroud, we have 87% of people vaccinated for the first time and 55% fully vaccinated. Thankfully, only 3 people are in hospital in Gloucestershire with COVID, and I pray for their swift recovery. So at a time when our hospitals are nowhere near overwhelmed by COVID and we're told we need to learn to live with the virus, it's only right that we now look to protect the others from the impact of restrictions. To dismiss this delay as only 4 weeks is disrespectful. These weeks are crucial for many, but not least for businesses who are invested money and hope in being able to trade viably next week. Those in the hospitality, entertainment, weddings, and exercise and the travel sectors, for these summer weeks, they follow a lost summer last year and they cannot be made up over the autumn and winter months. Being involved in the negotiations for the wedding industry has also led me to this position. Months of work, evidence gathering and sensible suggestions were swept aside by health officials at the last minute without explanation and against a backdrop of thousands of people hugging at the football and the cricket, which I love, by the way. Why reject testing in like we have in sporting events and then make a father wear a mask walking his daughter down the aisle? He will eat a maskless dinner with her later in that day. What have we come to when the government is banning dance floors? And I am equally confuzzled by banning singing in churches. Our predominantly double-jabbed congregations just want to sing to God. Let them sing.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Madam Deputy Speaker, these are not easy decisions. The difficulties facing our government are extraordinary, and I sincerely respect those on both sides of the House who have different views. I have the utmost respect for the Prime Minister and Health Secretary, and I don't mind saying out loud this was a difficult decision, but with the welfare of Stroud firmly in my mind, I praise the courage and sacrifice that the people of this great nation have shown, and I say that now is the time for us to trust the people, give them their Freedom Day.
Cheers.
Richard Drack.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What on earth is happening to our country, Madam Deputy Speaker? Muzzled, acquiescent and fearful. Having fought and defeated one Project Fear, I never thought we'd experience another. Sadly, unlike the first, the polls would suggest that the majority of the population has succumbed to the second. Armed with this information, the decision makers feel they can creep out with their shovels and move the goalposts at will. Personally, I'm not surprised the nation's been beaten into submission when day after day, hour after hour, we are deluged with dire warnings of doom and gloom by government advisers of one kind or another. A section of the press and media must take responsibility for their role in creating this near Orwellian nightmare. Don't get me wrong, I have never underestimated the threat this pandemic poses. Every death and illness is deeply regrettable. But surely there comes a time when, for the greater good of the majority, a sense of proportion must be adopted. This is not easy to do when graphs and statistics are presented to support this 1 month extension, despite those far better qualified than I who question their methodology, presentation, and even accuracy. So much that was predicted has not come to pass, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the so-called third wave is not killing or hospitalising anywhere near the numbers affected in wave 1 or 2. Why? Well, it's due to this remarkable vaccine rollout, for which the government, the front bench, the NHS must take huge credit. From the initial promise of regaining our freedom when the vulnerable have been inoculated, I can understand the government's reluctance to give it back. First, it's easier to say no. And second, let's not forget, there's a public inquiry hanging over the government like the sword of Damocles. The revelations from Dominic Cummings and the accusations that followed them were no doubt a sobering taster to ministers of what is to come. However, fearing an inquiry and variance are not reasons for delaying Freedom Day. Mistakes have been made. That was inevitable given the unprecedented nature of this pandemic, but that does not mean being risk-averse now. We desperately need a confident government to take a proportionate stand in the face of the evidence. For months, the government's cry was, protect the NHS. On Tuesday, the organisation's chief executive said that only 1% of hospital beds were occupied by patients. We know that emissions are rising in the northwest, but not on the scale seen in the second wave. Yes, totally unlocking is a risk, but it's a proportionate one when considering the appalling damage being done to the risk takers, those who create our prosperity and jobs, and the continuing and successful rollout of the vaccines. And as for this place, I've been here long enough to know that when there's agreement across the majority of the House, something is fundamentally wrong.
55 is withdrawn, so we go straight to James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, over the past few months I've repeatedly called for an end to restrictions at the earliest opportunity, and I believe that the success of our vaccination programme gives us that opportunity. We are all aware of the pain that's been inflicted on so many: leisure, tourism, hospitality, aviation, the list goes on. This has manifested itself in the loss of jobs and livelihoods, and whilst the government has done much to mitigate the fallout through its generous support schemes, it has just scratched the surface when what people really want to do is to return to normal. When you walk down the voting lobby, it's never a binary choice. No decision is clear-cut, for there are bits of every motion that you agree with and bits that you don't like. And for any self-respecting politician with the best interests of constituency, country and party at heart, you just hope that the stars do align. But I do have mixed feelings about the extension to the current lockdown rules. On the one hand, creating a wall of immunity amongst all adult demographics seems sensible so that we can move forwards. But by the same token, the ongoing restrictions in how we live our lives is killing business and people all over the UK. Not only is the cost to the taxpayer immense, but there's also a cost to our hopes, dreams and mental health. And the sooner we can smash through lockdown, the better. However, I've also been unequivocal that any policy decision needs to be driven by the science, and it remains a fact that the Delta variant is causing real concern, with infections, hospitalisations and deaths spiking alarmingly. Aside from all the disappointment, the PM could not have been clearer in his stated position at the weekend. And it may just be that our younger generation has an expectation of being vaccinated against a killer disease before all restrictions are lifted. And it may be that cases are growing by 65% per week, and it may be that hospitalisations are increasing by 50% per week across the UK, and it may be that the NHS does need and deserve 4 more weeks to complete its job. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the light of the evidence presented to me and the decisions that have been made in good faith, I will be supporting all government motions this evening. I'd like to raise 2 final points, if I may. Firstly, it's essential, please, that when the list of authorised pilots is released, that it must include those flagship global events such as the Euros, Wimbledon, British Grand Prix, Chelsea Flower Show and the Goodwood Festival of Speed. The alternative, I'm afraid, will be cataclysmic. And lastly, I am increasingly concerned by the dichotomy between the unprecedented success of our vaccination programme and the ongoing risk aversion with government. As a military man, I am comfortable with risk. And I feel that we all now need to live with COVID in a way that's not been achieved so far. So, using military parlance, given that we cannot transfer or terminate it, and Lord knows we've tried to treat it, it is now time to robustly tolerate COVID. I've got a feeling that all goodwill will be exhausted if the government does not honour its promise on the 19th of July. Thank you.
Pauline Latham, not here. So we go straight to Miriam Cates.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following the science is an attractive, even comforting idea in a time of uncertainty. But, and I say this as a scientist, we can no more follow science than we can follow history. Science gives us knowledge and understanding, but it can't give us wisdom. And it's wisdom that we need to make what are essentially moral and political decisions about how we balance the short and long-term best interests of our whole society. I'm saddened that we have lost, I hope only temporarily, this sense of balance. Preventing death from COVID seems to have become the principal purpose of our national endeavour, no matter the cost to our way of life. We've placed insufficient emphasis on the terrible long-term consequences of lockdown, from poverty, unemployment, lost education, debt, undiagnosed cancer, loneliness, hopelessness and fear, and focused far too narrowly on just one set of metrics, the daily COVID data. Now, even the most hardened libertarian would accept that in a national emergency, in the face of significant threat to life, restrictions to our freedoms have been necessary and right. But with all vulnerable people now having been offered vaccination, the balance of risk has shifted. COVID is no longer a substantial threat. The average COVID mortality for June so far is 7 deaths a day, 7 out of around 1,500 daily deaths that we could expect in normal times. The number of people in hospital now stands at 1,177, some 37,000 fewer than at the peak in January. And thanks to the incredible efficacy of our vaccination programme, it's hard to comprehend how our hospitals could quickly become overwhelmed. The idea that we are still in a state of emergency just isn't supported by the evidence. And yet significant legal restrictions on our basic freedoms are to remain, even dictating how many of our family and friends can visit us in our own private homes. The restrictions we face are now out of proportion to the threat, and so extending the measures sets a dangerous precedent. Madam Deputy Speaker, we must learn to live with COVID in the way that we live with so many other risks. Vaccines will never be 100% effective, just like seatbelts, smoke alarms or contraception. But it's vital to our autonomy and our identity as human beings that we're able to make our own choices and our own evaluations of everyday risks, as has been the norm in our country for generations. Now, I have the greatest respect for ministers who've had to make unimaginably difficult decisions over the last year. But now is the time to restore a sense of balance and proportion and fairness, and to make a return to life in all its fullness. And in my final seconds, I want to say this. Childhood should be a time that is carefree. And testing our children twice a week, making them wear masks when they are not at risk, constantly reminding them that they may be a danger to people that they love, is damaging them psychologically, and we have to stop.
If everybody was now 2 minutes, everybody would get in. I'm sure Dr. Kieran Mullen will lead the way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've listened carefully to the contributions this afternoon, and we've done a good job, I think, in articulating the challenge we face. Basically, what is reasonable to do to stop coronavirus spreading, infecting and killing enormous numbers of people and overwhelming the NHS? The answer to that asks us to consider what the costs are for doing something and what the costs are for doing nothing. There has been a cost to freedom from lockdowns, but freedom is complex. What freedom would people aged over 50 years and up have had to venture out of their home when coronavirus ran rampant and left them with at least a 1 in 200 chance or worse of dying if they caught it? There's been a cost to businesses, in particular hospitality and other businesses people have been stopped from visiting. I'm certain that had our NHS been overwhelmed, should 1 in 200 people aged 50 started dying en masse, should the news have been showing patients turned away from ITU, the impact on those businesses would have been similar, if not the same as lockdown. There's been a cost to children's welfare. Which parent would really have carried on sending their children to school knowing that there would be no help if there was an outbreak of meningitis or measles? And how traumatised would the nation's children have been when 1 in 200 or more of their grandparents died in the space of a year or two? There's been a cost to people with illnesses like cancer from lockdown. Where exactly would cancer patients have gone after their operations when ITUs were full? And which immunocompromised patients having chemo would have risked visiting their local hospital for treatment and running the risk of catching COVID? It's wrong for critics of lockdown to think they alone care about freedom, hospitality businesses, children, those suffering from other illnesses. We all do. I do. I just took what I thought was the rational choice in weighing up the costs across the board. I must take issue with people today who've talked about our freedoms not being used to support the NHS as if that's some kind of abstract concept. What we're talking about there is supporting the patients and their friends and family who had been prevented from accessing the NHS if the restrictions had not prevented the NHS from being overwhelmed. It was always inevitable over time that these judgments would have become more finely balanced as they have done. But I'm not going to be told that I'm not capable of continuing to make these finely balanced judgments. It's right that the next phase means a new discussion. Like others, I found these types of restrictions that stop us living out our fundamental desires to mix and socialise and spend time with each other, a heavy, heavy price to pay. And I've no doubt that the public will be willing to pay a similarly heavy price to remove most, if not all of them. But that's not to say people won't mind wearing a mask on the tube, for example. We have some tough decisions ahead of us, and I welcome the recognition of that from government. And it's now time that the government states more clearly and starkly what these choices are for us, so that the British public can start to decide together what sacrifices we are and are not willing to make.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As MPs, we're asked to take fundamentally political decisions, balancing the certainty of harm done to people's livelihoods and well-being that's caused by restrictions with the imminent risk to people's lives and to the ability of our health services to cope if the pandemic were to spiral out of control. We can only do so on the basis of the very best medical and scientific advice that is available. Now, 2 weeks ago, I was sure that there was no reason why Step 4 should not go ahead on the 21st of June. Within days, that certainty looked foolish. The advice now is clear that pressing ahead on Monday would lead to massive increases in admissions that would leave our hospitals with more COVID patients than in the worst points of last year. And given that, and the clear guidance from our local NHS leaders of the impact that this would have on their ability to treat people in need, the only responsible course of action is to pause. However, that does not mean that we should not question and test that advice. Unlike some, I do not believe that the advice is being manipulated to secure a specific outcome. This is not another 45-minute dossier. But some of the modelling does look strange. Some of the assumptions could be questionable. The effectiveness of the vaccines are estimated at 89 and 90% in the modelling, whereas Public Health England data puts it at 92 and 96%. Now, the difference between 89% and 96% might not sound huge, but if you flip it around, then the difference in ineffectiveness rate between 4% and 11% is enormous and clearly would have significant policy implications. Now, the models project 2,500 hospital admissions per day within 8 weeks. That suggests a rate of increase of 40% per week, much higher than we are currently experiencing. Now, if that increase was actually 30%, then the admissions would be close to 1,400 per day. And if the current rate of 22% that we've seen in the last week was to continue, then it would reach just 800 after 8 weeks. And surely those differences would lead to different policy choices. And that is why this 2-week breakpoint is important, and why it's vital that ministers take it seriously. I will back the motions tonight, but if the data over the next 2 weeks do not bear out the hypotheses in the models, we must rethink.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have been contacted by many constituents who are concerned about the extension of these restrictions, especially when cases and hospitalisations are still at a low absolute level. I also represent a central London constituency, and central London is suffering very hard as a result of the fact that people are still encouraged to work at home, the fact that we have very few international business visitors and residents, and unemployment is looking very bad here. However, I do acknowledge the fact that clearly with 2 shots of the vaccines, there is no question that there is better resistance to hospitalisation. So I will support government tonight for one final heave over the line. But I would urge government to make sure that we do not lose the benefit of 2 vaccines. For instance, why are we still encouraging people to work from home when they are doubly vaccinated? Why are we asking people to quarantine at home if they have been in contact with a case when they are double vaccinated? We really do need to refine and perfect all of these features, because this is having a meaningful impact on people's lives. So I will support the government, but we've got work to do and we need to get out of these restrictions.
Number 43 is withdrawn, so we go to Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've supported the government throughout on coronavirus measures, but today we've come very close to the point, for me personally, that the line has been breached, and I have listened to some very persuasive speeches from colleagues who have come to that point today. My honourable friend from Stroud, my honourable friend from Penistone and Stocksbridge today. I myself am sticking with the government on this occasion for the reasons that the member for North Somerset gave earlier, the same reasons in fact that the Health Secretary gave me in the lobbies earlier, the need to get those second jabs into people who are still at risk of hospitalisation. But like my friend from Dudley South recently said, we must take that 2-week review seriously, because there is evidence even today that we are starting to bend the curve of exponential growth. The R rate is starting to fall on cases in England. We know there is a 10-day lag to hospitalisations, but we've also seen the hospitalisation percentages falling. It was 8% of cases turned into hospitalisations in the autumn. It's down to 4% now. If that continues to drop, the case the government is making will get weaker and weaker. I would like to briefly pay tribute to the Health Secretary, not only for all his work on this, his assiduousness in coming to the House today, also for helping me in Newcastle-under-Lyme with a major public health issue of a landfill that he's been incredibly engaged with. I think the Health Secretary has done a fantastic job throughout this pandemic, and I welcome what he said today, and that he himself obviously has his reservations, but this is the right decision for the country at this time. And very briefly, as I serve on the Procedure Committee with my right honourable friend, the member for Staffordshire Moorlands as chair, she spoke earlier, I will be supporting those motions as well, because as we've said in the committee, I think it's absolutely fundamental that we align what we do in this House with what we're asking the country to do.
Chris Loder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate, one that I know is of huge importance both to this House and to the country. Madam Deputy Speaker, as the member for West Dorset, we have had one of the lowest numbers of cases and deaths across the whole country. As it stands today, in the whole of Dorset, we have just one person poorly in hospital. We have not lost anybody from this virus for around 2 months. It is therefore with great regret that I have to tell the government today that I find it very difficult to support the government, and I will not be doing so in the lobby this evening. The vaccinations that I think many, if not all of us, have received have been, I think, a scheme of national pride. It has brought great reassurance to many, many people across this country. But we now have to help everybody in the nation, particularly those who, in my constituency, where 97% of our businesses are small or micro-sized, who are feeling this so painfully at the moment. We need to be able to give them the summer as the opportunity to get their business back, not just for the short term, but for the long term as well. And it is therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, why I, as the member for West Dorset, have to make it very clear to the government this evening that I'm afraid I'm unable to support the vote in the lobby. Thank you.
We now go to Neil O'Brien, who I've also asked if he could stick to 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. None of us want these restrictions to go on for a moment longer than they have to. And all of us are proud of our world-leading vaccination effort, and I pay tribute to everyone involved in delivering it in Harborough, Oadby and Wigston. But when we see that cases are doubling roughly every 10 days, we see that within a week or two, we'll be back to the same number of cases every day that we were at the start of the November lockdown. We can see why there is real cause for concern here. And that is why it is right to go for the delay that we're going to vote for this evening. We know that getting a second vaccination dose gives you a lot more protection against this dangerous new variant. We know that many more people will be fully vaccinated as a result of this delay, and that will potentially save thousands of lives. So it is the right thing to do. My pleas to ministers are as follows. The first is that we use this time that we're buying tonight to really drive vaccination rates among that last 4%, that last maybe million people, among the most clinically vulnerable groups. As the number of cases accelerates, those people have got a target on their back, and it would be a tragedy for them to die of fear or ignorance or simple lack of knowledge at this stage, at the very end of the pandemic. Second, my pleas to minister is to continue to improve our ability to detect at an early stage and close our borders against dangerous new strains. While the Indian variant is very dangerous, as this thing bounces around the world, one day there'll potentially be something worse, and we need to be ready for that. And last but not least, we must improve our ability to nip future pandemics in the bud. And I think that involves reappraising our attitudes towards things like challenge trials so that we never have to go through this again. Madam Deputy Speaker, the restrictions that we are going to delay ending for a few more weeks tonight, it's the right thing to do. It's a difficult decision. It's the right decision. And we need to do all the things we need to put in place to make sure that we are never in this position again. And when we abolish these restrictions, we abolish them forever.
Thank you. Number 47 is withdrawn. So the final speaker is Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's always a little bit trepidatious coming at this part of a debate. I think this has been a very finely balanced debate this evening, and the difficulty is after so many great contributions, you do feel like you're repeating yourself a bit. But this is a difficult decision, and I don't envy the position the government finds themselves in. And it is a nuanced balance that we've got to tread. On the one hand, ensuring that we protect the most vulnerable. On the other hand, safeguarding those liberties that all of us, I think, actually on this House want to ensure that we and our constituents can enjoy. Now, the pandemic in my communities in Sandwell has been different because we haven't been able to work from home. The majority of my constituents have had to go out to work in this pandemic. They've had to be in the factories. They've had to be in the jobs that require them to be there. So I think the first thing I would say is to dispel that idea, perhaps, that at times this notion of, well, we can all carry on, we can all work from home, just doesn't happen, I'm afraid. It's not. It's just not reality. But I think the important point that I would say, and I think it's been raised by many honourable and right honourable members across the House this evening, is about utilising the time that we will now have as a result of this, because this will go through this evening, and ensuring that we plan properly, and the issues and the challenges that we're faced with in our NHS. And I want to talk actually particularly, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, about primary care, because that is a big thing for my constituents, no more so at the moment than in one of my communities in Tividale, where my constituents are struggling to get to GP appointments. I've had one constituent contact me today 150 times. She's had to call the surgery to try and get in to see someone. It is not acceptable. It cannot carry on. And I've had really positive discussions with my honourable friend and his team in the Department of Health, but we've got to find a solution to this. And it's using this time, not just in the short term, but fleshing out that long-term plan to deal with these issues going forward, because our NHS has done a fantastic job during this pandemic. We've now got to ensure that the issues that we've seen highlighted, that have come to light as a result of the situation we find ourselves in, are dealt for the long term. So the legacy of this pandemic, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we ensure that we pay back those NHS heroes who have saved so many people. Thank you.
49 withdrawn. So Shadow Minister Justin Matters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I just start by associating myself with the many members who paid tribute to Jo Cox today. As we heard from the tributes, she transcended intake and party in bringing people together, and my thoughts are with her family at this time. In terms of the debate, there's been, I think, a number of excellent contributions on both sides, and people who will be voting in different ways actually often made many similar points, which I think shows the disappointment we all feel that we are here once again grappling with many overlapping and multiple considerations. And I think there were some particularly thought-provoking contributions from this side of the chamber, from my honourable friends for Blackley and Broughton, City of Chester, Luton North, Leeds East and Stockport. And I particularly enjoyed my honourable friend, the member for Luton North's speech, and her repeated use of the word hopeless, a word I am sure is on many people's lips at the moment. And she was right that we have been here before, as we were at Christmas with a Prime Minister dangling the carrot of freedom before pulling away at the last minute. It is the hallmark of a Prime Minister who struggles to deliver bad news to the public. A similar point was made by my honourable friend, the member for Leeds East, that there is a pattern here of the government making the same mistakes over and over again. And he also rightly highlighted the continuing failure to provide adequate financial support for those who self-isolate, a point that was also made by my honourable friend, the member for Stockport, a particularly apposite point today when a government report has reached the news that the current self-isolation policy has a low to medium effectiveness and there are barriers to self-isolation. This is a point we have been making since the start of the pandemic, and it is about time the government listened to us and their own advisors and fixed it. And it would be remiss of me not to highlight the fantastic contribution from my honourable friend and neighbour, the member for the City of Chester. He drew attention to how this announcement came out once again via the media, and he also raised an important point about the enhanced measures a number of areas, including our own county of Cheshire, have been put into this week. We have unfortunately seen a surge in cases, but there is apparently no prospect of us getting a rise in vaccines. Yes, go on.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Speaking to my fellow healthcare professionals in my local hospital vaccination centre weeks ago, many of them expressed their concerns about the Delta variant and a possible impact it could have on the local NHS and on delaying lockdown. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the government needs to do more to prevent workplace burnout by providing more workplace support to our fellow healthcare professionals who have spent the past 18 months supporting the government through their incompetency?
My honourable friend for her intervention, she's absolutely right. We owe a great debt to those in the NHS and those who have also worked on the front line during the past 18 months. And of course there was a very important select committee report released last week on the issue of burnout, which I really do hope the government address, because without the workforce, the NHS is nothing. But returning to the issues in Cheshire, we haven't had an increase in vaccines that the surge in cases requires. Indeed, it's what the government's own scientific advisors say is the best way to deal with such an outbreak. We have constituents being sent far and wide to get their first jab, and we've got fantastic volunteers and NHS workers ready, willing and able to deliver those jabs, but we need the government to match that ambition by increasing supply. That will be where we can make the most difference. And my honourable friend also made a very important point about how we're now in the worst of all worlds with the new guidance issued at the same time as these regulations came in. We're now advised not to meet indoors, again diverting people away from the hospitality sector, which was just opening up again, but without a penny more in financial support for them. And of course he also mentioned there are other sectors that have been affected by today's regulations that are still not getting any additional financial support to recognise the change in policy that we've seen. And on the issue of guidance and law, I do hope the Minister opposite does look at the House of Lords Select Committee report on the Constitution, which was produced last week, and they said that the use of guidance has in some instances undermined legal certainty by laying claim to legal requirements that do not exist. They said the government does not have and must not assume authority to mandate public behaviour other than as required by law, and that the consequence of this has been a lack of clarity on which rules are legally enforceable, posing challenges for the police and local government, potentially undermining public compliance and confidence. So if living with COVID means living with guidance rather than laws, I really do urge the government to read that report before they proceed down that road. And I wonder when the Minister responds if he will be able to clarify whether the government are still making decisions based on data rather than dates. I say that because, as was raised by my honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, the Prime Minister was pretty clear in his own words that the 19th of July was the terminus date for restrictions. Yet, as we pointed out, paragraph 7.4 of the explanatory note accompanying these regulations states that the reason for the delay is to enable more evidence to be gathered on whether the government's tests under the roadmap can be met in light of the Delta variant. There would be little point, Madam Deputy Speaker, in gathering this data if it were not to be used to inform future decisions. So that rather implies the 19th of July might not be the end date after all. And as the Right Honourable Member for the Forest of Dean pointed out, there is no mention in the explanatory note, all the regulations about this 2-week point at which things will be reconsidered. And of course we all hope that the 19th of July is the end date, but we have been down the road of false promises before many times in the past 18 months, and I don't think it's unreasonable for us to be a little bit sceptical of what the Prime Minister says and what actually materialises given his record to date. So any clarity the Minister can shed on this and what the actual precise reason for the delay is would be much appreciated. But of course this delay wasn't inevitable. It didn't have to be this way. The delays to our unlocking that we're debating this evening were not inevitable. They were in fact totally avoidable. The British public have been magnificent throughout this crisis. They've followed the rules and they've played their part. But when they see world leaders ignoring social distancing at a barbecue but are told the rules cannot yet be relaxed for them, when they see thousands of people attending football matches but they're told they cannot attend their own children's school sports day, they grow frustrated at what they see as a lack of consistency from those who make the rules. But that frustration grows into anger when they see a Prime Minister who has thrown it all away by keeping the borders open and letting the Delta variant run wild in the country. As a result, the Delta variant is now making up 96% of new infections. That didn't happen by accident, and as the Chief Medical Officer said on Monday, we would be lifting restrictions now if it were not for the Delta variant. All that good work, all the benefits of the vaccine, blown because the Prime Minister was once again too slow, just as he was too slow with the first lockdown, the second lockdown, and the third. I know the government will say that they acted as soon as they could on the information they had, but the explanation why they didn't act sooner on the Delta variant has actually changed in the last few days. We were initially told on multiple occasions that the data did not support putting India on the red list earlier because positivity rates of the new variant were 3 times higher for Pakistan. But now we are told the reason why it wasn't put on earlier is because the variant had not been identified as one of interest or concern. Neither explanation stands up to scrutiny. The only published data on the Indian variant does not show a positivity rate 3 times as high for Pakistan, and the idea that action was taken shortly before it was designated as a variant of concern does not explain why Pakistan and Bangladesh were red-listed weeks earlier. The only credible explanation I can therefore find for treating India differently is that the Prime Minister didn't want to scupper his trade visit and photo opportunity with the Indian Prime Minister. So instead of excuses, we should be getting an apology, because it is beyond doubt that it is the Prime Minister's incompetence, dithering and vanity that has cost this country dear, and that is the only reason that the full unlocking of this country is not going ahead next week. Having heard today via WhatsApp on Dominic Cummings what the Prime Minister thinks of the Health Secretary, I wonder if the Health Secretary has at any point in the last few weeks had similar feelings towards the Prime Minister. If he has, then that is something that at least we can both agree on.
Mr. Edward Arbour.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And at the outset, I would associate myself with the remarks of the Shadow Minister in respect of our late colleague, Joe Cox. As we stand at this dispatch box, we can see the coat of arms above the opposition benches, and I pay tribute to her and to all her work while she was in this place and before. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would much rather I were not standing here today seeking to urge and encourage colleagues to have to vote for this motion. I know that colleagues would wish that this was not necessary, but I regret it is. We have made huge progress that has been made possible by our phenomenal vaccine rollout programme. And the tribute for that goes to the scientists who developed the vaccine, those who procured it, the NHS, and all the volunteers, charities, the military, the Sons Jabs Army, everyone who's played their part in helping deliver this programme. That progress has also been made possible by the incredible efforts of course, the British people, and by the dedication of everyone who works in our health and care system. And I know, again, the Shadow Minister would join with me in expressing our joint gratitude to all of them. As the Prime Minister set out on Monday, this vaccine remains our route out of this pandemic. And with every day that goes by, we are better protected by our vaccines. But the Delta variant has made the race between virus and vaccine much tighter. Cases continue to grow rapidly each week in the worst affected areas. The number of people being admitted to hospital in England has also begun to rise, and the numbers of people in ICUs is also rising. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the vaccine remains our way out. Data published this week shows that 2 doses of the jab are just as effective against hospital admission with the Delta variant compared to the Alpha variant, and indeed may even be more effective against the Delta variant. But it underlines, Madam Deputy Speaker, the importance of that second jab and the need for more of us to have the chance to get its life-saving protection. Now, my right honourable friend, the member for North Somerset, put it far more effectively than I dare say I will be able to do. He was absolutely right to highlight the crucial importance over the next few weeks of getting those second jabs, particularly the AstraZeneca vaccine, into people's arms. He's right to highlight that the Pfizer vaccine after one jab is highly effective. But we need those 2 jabs of the AstraZeneca vaccine to provide that level of protection. It's important in that context to remember that, of course, the AZ vaccine is the workhorse of our vaccination programme. Over 30 million people have now received their second jab. And in 1 month's time, that number could stand as high as 40 million. And my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, highlighted in his remarks a very important factor in getting those second doses in people's arms. There are still 1.2 million over 50s who've had the first dose. They're not declining the vaccine. They've had the first dose, but they need the second dose to provide that high level of protection. And similarly, there are 4.4 million of the over 40s who, again, need that second dose. And with the Delta variant now making up 9 in 10 of the cases across the UK, it's vital we bridge the gap and get many more people that life-saving second jab. This extra time will allow us to get more needles into more arms, getting us the protection we need and enabling us to see restrictions fall away on the 19th. And in that vein, I would remind colleagues of the quote from the Prime Minister on Monday, where he was very clear that as things stand, and on the basis of the evidence I can see right now, I'm confident we will not need any more than 4 weeks, and that we won't need to go beyond July the 19th. Turning, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the choice we face, very, very briefly, but it needs to be very brief because I've only got 3 minutes.
You've just said that the Prime Minister has given assurances that there's another 4 weeks, but we've had this time and time again. Why should the British people believe the Prime Minister now?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is the British people do believe the Prime Minister now. Madam Deputy Speaker, we face a difficult choice, and my honourable friend, the member for Bosworth, set it out extremely clearly. It reflects that underlying debate about risk. We know, and I am clear, that we must learn to live with this disease and learn to live with it without the sort of restrictions we have seen. We cannot eradicate it. And I have to say again, rather than relying on the views of the member for Leeds East, I'm more inclined to rely on the views of the member for North Somerset, the Right Honourable member for North Somerset, who made that point very clear. And being very clear, those who advocate a zero COVID must realise that is impractical, unachievable, and I consistently do not subscribe to the logic of those who argue for that course. But to get to the point where we can learn to live with this disease, I'm sure the House will agree an extra few weeks is a price worth paying, so I do urge the House to support these regulations today. No one, of course, can fail to be unsympathetic to those who will be affected by this delay, like those couples who want to start their married lives together but have had in the past to change or delay their plans. It weighs on me greatly, as it will on all honourable members, and in this case I was pleased that we could ease the restrictions on weddings. Equally, I am very mindful of those whose livelihoods will be affected by any delay in our roadmap. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I urge the House to support this motion. It provides a short-term delay that significantly strengthens our position for the longer term. Now, my right honourable friend, the member for the Forest of Dean, raised a couple of specific points which I will try and answer here, and they relate to one another. He mentioned para 7.7 of the explanatory memorandum and his concern that the first review date was on the 19th of July. I would just clarify, it's the first review date is due by Monday the 19th of July and will be in advance at that point. That's a legal end point, and I would anticipate an announcement coming probably a week before that of what that decision is and what that date is. I hope that gives him some reassurance about people having notice of what is coming. Madam Deputy Speaker, in closing, I wish to express my sincere thanks to all those who've contributed to today's debate. I'm sorry there were so few on the opposition benches who chose to take part, but to those who did, and to those on this side of the House, I pay tribute to them for the sincerity, for the strength of feeling, and for the integrity that honourable members have shown. I hope the House recognises that I have a deep-seated respect for all the views I've heard this afternoon. Honourable members all want the same thing, which is to save lives and to see us exit these restrictions and return to normality as soon as possible. Difficult as it may be, I urge honourable members across this House to vote for these measures, to give ourselves that short extra time to vaccinate more people, crucially with that second dose, and take us forward to a stronger, more confident future. That I know is just around the corner, that like all honourable members, I seek and we all seek, and which I am confident this Prime Minister will take us to. Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend the motion to the House.
The question is motion number 2 as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Division, clear the lobby. The question is motion number 2 as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tell us for the ayes, Maggie Throop and Maria Caulfield. Tell us for the noes, Steve Baker and Jackie Doyle-Price. Lock the doors. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 461. The noes to the left, 60.
The ayes to the right, 461. The noes to the left, 60. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock. We now come to motion number 3 on proceedings during the pandemic. Minister to move formally.
I beg to move.
The question is motion number 3 as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Aye. Division, clear the lobby. Question is motion number 3 as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no.
No.
Tell us for the ayes, Maria Caulfield and Maggie Throop. Tell us for the noes, Jackie Doyle-Price and Steve Baker. Lock the doors. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 588. The noes to the left, 25.
The ayes to the right, 588. The noes to the left, 25. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock. We now come to motion number 4 on constitutional law. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Giles Watling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a great pleasure to speak on this important issue once again. Colleagues may remember that I introduced a private member's bill to regulate the use of sonic anti-loitering devices in 2018. In my view, unregulated, these things can be a menace. They are discriminatory, painful to some, and can cause suffering to children, babies, and animals. I find it amazing that some in civilized Britain even consider them to be a useful adjunct to policing. That is the stuff of totalitarian regimes. We police by consent, not by fear and pain. I won't simply regurgitate my earlier speech now, but I'd like to remind the House of some key points. Sonic anti-loitering devices, also known as mosquitoes or teenager repellents, target young people with a pulsing sound. My daughters tell me it's like a prolonged beep, akin to tinnitus, and some devices emit ultrasound specifically to achieve this effect. There are no firm figures for how many of these devices there are nationally, although manufacturers claim to have sold thousands. In 2010, the Council of Europe found that this device was degrading and discriminatory to youngsters and should be banned because it violates legislation prohibiting torture. Academics also contest that these devices contravene several pieces of UK legislation regarding antisocial behaviour and discrimination. Despite the assertions of manufacturers, there are reports that people as old as 40 can hear these devices, and those who use them neglect their impact on very young children, babies, and animals, as I have said, all of whom will struggle to communicate any distress caused. Likewise, those who use these devices ignore the impact on those with pre-existing conditions that make them especially sensitive, such as autism. Many children with these conditions cannot avoid long-term exposure because they might live next door to somebody who has one of these devices, or their school might be close to one of these devices, and they could equally struggle to communicate any distress. Now, there's a lack of research on the harm caused by these devices, especially the effects of ultrasound, on the impact on those who can't even hear them. 40% of young people regularly come across these devices, but 75% of young people said that they would just put up with the irritating noise and go where they want, when they want anyway, and do what they want. So these devices won't stop those who want to commit antisocial behaviour necessarily, but they will harm innocent young people in public spaces. And finally, these devices have been banned on all council buildings in Sheffield, Kent, Edinburgh and Dublin on safety grounds. So as it stands, Madam Deputy Speaker, I still believe that we don't know enough about these devices to be confident that they are indeed safe, and therefore we must control their use. Moreover, these potentially dangerous devices are not wholly successful in preventing antisocial behaviour, as they do not stop those intending to do harm from entering a certain public space if they are so minded. And even if these devices were effective against ASB at a certain location, we would just be moving criminals and their urge to cause damage somewhere else. Consequently, I believe these devices are not a solution for antisocial behaviour. They only succeed in causing distress to those young people who cannot avoid them, but who have a right to use public spaces where they are often located. Now, there are plenty of examples of innocent young people feeling unable to use railway and bus stations, shops, schools and spaces in their own town centres, all places where these devices have been installed and all places that young people are entitled to visit safely. Indeed, there are reports from a Scottish survey that 41% of young respondents experienced health effects or discomfort after encountering a device. And I highly doubt whether any of them were engaged in any sort of antisocial behaviour at the time. According to those respondents, discomfort included headaches, migraines, ear problems, tinnitus, dizziness, nausea, anxiety, and/or panic. And we've not even touched on the potential effect on wildlife and animal habitats. Both can be equally affected by these devices. However, despite my clear opposition to these devices, I'm not seeking an outright ban, as there are circumstances, and I understand there are, where these devices could legitimately be used, such as warehouses, business premises, railway lines, industrial estates, and electricity pylons, for instance, places where nobody should be in the first place. Also, there's a strong case for using them to deter animals around food stores and such. If the owners of such locations wish to use these devices, they should be able to do so, but they must be used responsibly with proper oversight. And that is why in my private member's bill, I argued that the use of these devices should be regulated with a necessary license obtained by the local authority before use. In short, I don't argue that these devices should be better regulated just because they are ineffective, but their use should be better regulated because they're also discriminatory and potentially hazardous to health, with a particularly acute impact on the most vulnerable. Moreover, I do not believe that it is fair for members of the public of any age to be exposed to these devices without adequate control. There are too many stories of families suffering because these devices have been installed nearby and they have no effective power of redress under current legislation. And after bringing forward this proposal, I was grateful to the then Minister for Small Business, Consumers and Corporate Responsibility, the member for Rochester and Strood, for engaging with me on this issue. In her letter she sent to me on the 21st of April 2019, she set out how she'd asked officials in the Office for Product Safety and Standards to consider the evidence against these devices. Now, I was disappointed in the office's conclusion that these devices do not present a safety risk. And I maintain that this position is based on insufficient evidence. We just don't know enough about these devices to know either way, because the research just isn't there. So the only safe approach is to be cautious. And following a further letter to the same minister arguing that point, she set out the following in her subsequent reply of the 8th of June 2019. Firstly, in response to my suggestion that these devices infringe on the rights of young people, mirroring an argument put forward by Northumbria University, she asked the Ministry of Justice to reply as this falls under their remit. Regrettably, with everything that we now know that took place in late 2019, I, quite understandably, did not receive a reply from Justice at that time. And I would be grateful if the current minister would follow up with his colleagues at that department on that point. Secondly, I asked the then Minister for further research to be undertaken by the OPSS into these devices. Unfortunately, at the time, the office had set out its priorities for research into the early 2020. So, of course, my request was not approved. Now, I believe that needs to change. We must improve our understanding of these devices, especially when it comes to the effect of ultrasound. Worryingly, as the former minister said in her first response to me, there is some evidence that ultrasound can cause potential health issues, although there is insufficient evidence that these potential health risks constitute safety risks. But that does not mean that those risks are not present. Currently, our knowledge of ultrasound is limited and flawed, and we simply do not fully understand its effects and cannot draw any definitive conclusions about its use. As Professor Timothy Layton set out in his September 2019 work on ultrasound, he said, whilst there is over 50 years of anecdotal reports on the adverse effects of ultrasound on humans, which has been supplemented by limited laboratory testing, the state of knowledge is insufficient to meet regulatory needs. Further, he concludes that the priority must be on ensuring that these devices are safe for any humans who may be exposed to them. It is not possible to do this with the current data on the adverse effects on humans. So we simply do not understand ultrasound enough to use it legitimately to support any policy positions. But we are doing just that by allowing the liberal use of devices that emit ultrasound, including anti-loitering sonic devices. We are dealing with a potential harm here, and we must increase our knowledge of these devices and their impacts. We owe that to those who have already been impacted inadvertently by these devices. And until we do, we must be cautious and properly oversee the use of these devices. We cannot continue to treat this as a case of safe until proven otherwise. Instead, I believe it must be a case of potential harm, use with caution and in controlled conditions. Therefore, I ask the Minister the following. I understand from previous correspondence that if further data or research emerges about the safety impact of such devices, then the OPSS will review their assessment. I would argue that such further research has emerged, some of which I've mentioned, and we need the OPSS to commission further work to increase our understanding of the long-term impact of ultrasound and the impact of exposure to these devices. I hope the current minister will consider taking that work forward, and I would welcome a meeting with him, perhaps with the representative of the OPSS, to discuss this further. I would also ask him to follow up with justice on the point about children's rights, which I mentioned earlier. I will write to him to set out these requests further. But for now, I thank him in advance for listening today and welcome any comments on these devices that he may have to share with us. Thank you.
Minister Paul Scully.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Clacton for securing today's important debate. Can I assure him that although this House did not need an anti-loitering device to empty this evening, that was in no way a reflection of his excellent speech when he outlined the points of his concerns about this important issue. As Consumer Minister, the safety of these products fall under my ministerial portfolio, and the safety of the public is a key priority for this government. The matter contributes to ensuring the safety of the public, and in particular children and young people. So I'm pleased to be able to discuss this important issue and thank my honourable friend, the member for Clacton, for the opportunity for us to exchange views on this matter. And indeed, I am aware that the honourable gentleman has had an exchange of letters with my predecessor on this subject, and as he has outlined, has a long history in discussing and raising these concerns. Many of the issues raised here today go beyond the issue of safety and fall within the remit of ministerial colleagues in other departments, and I'll ensure that my officials draw the hand side of this debate to the attention of relevant counterparts and continue to join up on this issue. And I'm more than happy to meet my honourable friend to discuss these issues further as he's requested to do so. But I think it would be useful. I'll happily give way.
First of all, can I congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for Clacton for bringing this forward. It's an excellent issue. But on the subject of safety of the general public, and knowing, as the Minister knows and I know and others know, the effect of autism and the numbers of children with autism there's across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, both as children and as adults. Does the Minister agree that the first thing in safety of the general public, that children with autism and adults with autism must be taken on board as a priority?
Clearly it's important. I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and wise as always, and it's important that we protect all children, but especially vulnerable children, clearly, and he raises an interesting point, and I'll talk a little bit more about safety in a second. But I just want to think it might be useful if I set out the context of the regulatory and enforcement regime with which products such as anti-loitering devices must comply. The Office for Product Safety and Standards, OPSS, as my honourable friend mentioned, is the UK's national product safety regulator. It was established in 2018 to lead and coordinate the product safety system, providing that national capacity and supporting local enforcement. And it plays a key role in protecting consumers from unsafe products and providing an environment enabling businesses to thrive. It works closely with a wide range of market surveillance authorities, including the Local Authority Trading Standards in Great Britain and Environmental Health in Northern Ireland, who have responsibility for enforcing product safety and compliance in the UK. The UK product safety system is one of the most robust in the world. It places strict obligations on those best placed to control and mitigate risk. We've got a comprehensive regulatory framework in place for product safety with stringent requirements on producers and distributors to ensure that their products are safe before they're placed on the market. Its approach places the obligation on those best placed, as I say, to control and mitigate the risk. The safety of acoustic anti-loitering devices, commonly known as mosquito devices, is regulated by the General Product Safety Regulations 2005, GPSR, and other product-specific laws, such as the Electrical Equipment Safety Regulations 2016. These provide a baseline of safety for applicable products, requiring that only safe products in their normal or reasonably foreseeable usage can be placed on the market. And where product-specific legislation applies, such as the Electrical Equipment Safety Regulations, the product must comply with a specific set of essential safety requirements before it can be placed on the market. Once on the market, businesses have a continuing responsibility to monitor the products and act if a safety issue is identified. And that current regulatory framework enables the relevant enforcing authority, either local authorities or OPSS, to investigate specific allegations of unsafe products and take action where it's appropriate to do so. That includes prompting businesses to take corrective action and provide additional advice to consumers or instigate a recall. I can confirm that there have been no reports of dangerous anti-loitering devices on the UK product safety database, and that database is used by regulators to share information about safety risks and ensure appropriate action is taken. When the government last reviewed and set out its position on the safety of these products in 2010, the Health and Safety Executive concluded that there was little likelihood of any long-term ill effects associated with the product, and that the use of anti-loitering devices should remain within the options available to local authorities in tackling antisocial behaviour. And that decision followed testing that was carried out by the National Physical Laboratory, which determined that mosquito devices didn't operate at a high enough volume to damage hearing. But we continue to monitor reports of safety in relation to all products, and if, as my predecessor had said, there is further evidence or data on the use and impact of anti-loitering devices, clearly we will review it. GPSR already provides protection for consumers from unsafe products. Where specific products are found to be unsafe, they can be removed from the market. So there's no current plans to introduce a licensing regime for anti-loitering devices on the basis of safety, as our current assessment is that the devices do not present a safety risk. But what we're discussing here today, several years after that testing was done, goes beyond safety and regulation by the GPSR. The basis of this debate today broadens to include considerations of human rights and potential psychological impacts, and the need to understand the potential for greater harms experienced by certain vulnerable groups. My department recognises this concern, but maintains that the GPSR already provides protection from consumers from unsafe products. But I want to take a few moments just to talk about the wider protections already in place and what government is doing to ensure that the freedoms of individuals are protected whilst also protecting the public. Whilst these are matters for my ministerial colleagues in other departments, I feel it will be useful to set these out in order to provide the broader context for our debate. Concern has been expressed about the impact of anti-loitering devices on the freedom of assembly. The government's committed to upholding the right to freedom of assembly and association for all, as protected by Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is given further effect domestically by the Human Rights Act 1998. The government's also committed to tackling and preventing antisocial behaviour, as we know that the serious impact that persistent antisocial behaviour can have on both individuals and communities. Everybody has a right to feel safe in their own homes and neighbourhoods. The Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014 seeks to put victims first, giving power to local people and enabling professionals to find the best solutions for their local area. To do this, local enforcement agencies have a range of tools and powers that they can use to respond quickly and effectively to antisocial behaviour through the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014, the 2014 Act. So it's up to local areas to decide how best to deploy these powers, depending on the specific circumstances. And that's because they're best placed to understand what's driving the behaviour in question, the impact that it's having, and to determine the most appropriate response. The Home Office issued statutory guidance, which was updated in January 2021 for the 2014 Act, to support agencies to make appropriate and proportionate use of the powers when they target specific problems in a public setting, depending on the circumstances. In a similar vein, where these devices may be misused and create a noise nuisance for members of the public, there are statutory protections in place to deal with noise nuisance. The potential impact of anti-loitering devices on children's rights is one that has been discussed. The UK government regularly reports to the UN Committee on the work we've been doing across the UK to implement the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and to promote children's rights. The UN Committee published a list of issues for the UK to report against early next year. One of these issues relates to anti-loitering mosquito devices and the measures taken to guarantee children's right to freedom of movement and peaceful assembly. The UK government response will involve the input of a number of government departments and devolved administrations, including the Crown dependencies and British Overseas Territories, and children's rights stakeholders to record progress. I'll ensure that my honourable friend receives a copy of that response when it's issued. Again, just in conclusion, I'd like to thank my honourable friend for bringing this topic for debate today. It's really important that government continues to keep the issues such as these with such wide-ranging interests and potential impacts under close review. And I thank my honourable friend for his time in bringing this and his dogged work in raising these concerns across government. I'd like to reassure him and the Honourable Gentleman for Strangford, who's here today, and others, that the government will always take steps, as appropriate, to ensure safety and protect the public. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Order, order.